This is Audible.
Macmillan Audio presents Fall of Night by Jonathan Mayberry. Read for you by William Dufresne. This one is for Sam Westmensch, and, as always, for Sarah Jo. Part 1. Containment. But I've a rendezvous with death at midnight in some flaming town. Alan Seeger, I Have a Rendezvous with Death. Chapter 1. Doll Factory Road, Stebbins County, Pennsylvania. This is Billy Trout, reporting live from the apocalypse. The car sat in the middle of the road, with the radio playing at full blast. All 4 doors were open. The windows were cracked, and there was one small red handprint on the glass. The voice on the radio was saying that this was the end of the world. There was no one in the car, no one in the streets, no one in any of the houses or stores. There wasn't a single living soul there to hear the reporter's message. It didn't matter, though. They already knew. Chapter 2. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Stebbins County Police Officer J.T. Hammond pushed on the crash bar and the door opened. There were bodies outside in the school parking lot. Scores of them, crumpled and broken. J.T. looked around for movement and saw none.
It's clear.
He stepped outside and held the door as the line of infected people shambled out. Adults and children. Billy Trout and J.T.'s partner Desdemona Fox came last, each of them holding a small child in their arms. The National Guardsmen popped several flares on the far side of the parking lot to attract the masses of living dead. On that side of the lot, behind the chain-link fence, all of the guard trucks sent up a continuous wail with their sirens. The dead shuffled that way, drawn by light and noise. One of the victims, a man who had been bitten by what had been his own wife and children, stared glassily at the stiffly moving bodies. Then he raised a weak arm and pointed to the soldiers.
Are they coming to help us?
He asked. They're coming, said Des, hating herself for the implied lie. She told the wounded to sit down by the wall. Some of them immediately fell asleep. Others stared with empty eyes at the glowing flares high in the sky. For a moment, it left Des, J.T., and Trout as the only ones standing, each of them holding a dying child. The tableau was horrific and surreal. They stared at each other, frozen into this moment, because the next was too horrible to contemplate. Then they saw movement. J.T. peered into the shadows.
They're coming.
The guard? Asked Des, a last flicker of hope in her eyes.
No,
he said. They heard the moans. For whatever reason, pulled by some other aspect of their hunger, a few of the dead had not followed the flares and the sirens, and now they staggered toward the living standing by the open door. More of them rounded the corner of the building, perhaps drawn by a more powerful force. The smell of fresh meat.
We have to go,
said Trout.
And right now,
agreed J.T. He kissed the little boy on the cheek and set him down on the ground between 2 sleeping infected. Trout sighed brokenly and did the same. Des Fox clung to the little girl in her arms.
There's more of them,
said Trout.
Des, come on,
murmured J.T. But Des turned away, as if protecting the little girl she held from him.
Please, Hoss.
Des,
I can't.
Give her to me, honey, J.T. said gently.
I'll take care of her. Don't worry.
It took everything Des had left to allow JT to take the sleeping girl from her arms. She shook her head, hating him, hating the world, hating everything. "Better get inside," JT warned. Some of the zombies were very close now, 20 paces. Trout ran to the door. "Des, JT, come on. We have to go. We can't leave this open or they'll get inside." Des reluctantly moved toward the door, backing away from the child she had to abandon. Trout reached and took her hand, and when she returned his squeeze, it was crushingly painful. He pulled her toward the door as the first of the dead stepped into the pale glow thrown by the emergency light. "JT, come on, let's go," Trout yelled. The big cop did not move. He held the little girl so gently, stroking her hair and murmuring to her. "JT!" cried Des. "We have to close the door." He smiled at her. "Yeah," he said. "You do." They waited for him to come, but he stayed where he was. "JT?" Des asked in a small, frightened voice. "What's wrong?" JT kissed the little girl's forehead and set her down with the others. Then he straightened and showed her his wrist. It was crisscrossed with glass cuts from the helicopter attack. "What?" she asked. He pushed his sleeve up. That was when she saw it. A semicircular line of bruised punctures. Des whimpered something. A question. "How?" "Upstairs, when those bastards tackled us. One of them got me. I didn't see which one. Doesn't matter. What's done is done." Then the full realization hit Des. "No!" It was all Trout could do to hold her back. She struggled wildly and even punched him. The blow rocked him, but he did not let go. He would never let go. Never. "No!" Des yelled. "You can't!" The dead were closing in on JT. He unslung the shotgun. Across the parking lot, the last flares were fading and the trucks turned off their sirens, one by one. "Go on home, honey," JT said. "No goddamn way, Hoss," she growled, fighting with Trout, hitting him, hurting him. "We stand together and we fucking well go down together." "Not this time," JT said. And he was smiling. Trout could see it, even if Des could not, that JT was at peace with this. "No, no, no," Des kept repeating. "I'm going to keep these bastards away from those kids as long as I can," said JT. "I need you to go inside. I need you to tell the National Guard to do what they have to do, but make sure they do it right. They got to wipe them all out. All of them." What he meant was as clear as it was horrible. "JT, don't leave me." He shook his head. "I won't ever leave you, kid. Not in any way that matters. Now, go on. There are 800 people inside the school, Des. There are children inside that building who need you. You can't leave them." And there it was. Des sagged against Trout, and he pulled her inside and held her tight as the door swung shut with a clang. They heard the first blasts of the shotgun. Trout didn't hear the next one, because Des was screaming. JT stood with his back to the line of bite victims, holding the shotgun by its double pistol grips, firing, pumping, firing. There was almost no need to aim. There were so many, and they were so close. He emptied the gun and used it as a club to kill as many as he could before his arms began to ache. Then he dropped the gun and pulled his Glock. He had one fill magazine left. He debated using the bullets on the wounded, but then he heard the whine of the helicopter's rotors change, intensify, draw closer. and he knew what would happen next. He just had to keep the monsters away from the children until then. Soon it would all be over, and it would happen fast. He took the gun in both hands and fired, and fired, and fired. Inside the school building, huddled together on the floor, Desdemona Fox and Billy Trout held each other as bullets hammered like cold rain on the walls. It seemed to go on forever. Pain and noise and death seemed to be the only things that mattered anymore. And then, silence. Plaster dust drifted down on them as the roar of the helicopter's rotors dwindled to faintness, and then was gone. "It's over," Trout whispered. He stroked Dez's hair and kissed her head and wept with her. "I won't ever leave you, Dez. Never." Dez slowly raised her head. Her face was dirty and streaked with tears, and her eyes were filled with grief and hurt. She raised trembling fingers to his face. She touched his cheeks, his ear, his mouth. "I know," she said. Dez wrapped her arms around Trout with crushing force. He allowed it, gathering her even closer. They clung to one another and sobbed hard enough to shatter the whole ugly world. Chapter 3. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. The gunship hung in the air like a monstrous insect. Except for the heavy beat of the rotors, there was no sound, inside or out. Sergeant Hap Rollins, the door gunner, crouched behind the M134 minigun, mouth acrid with the gun smoke he had swallowed, his ears ringing with remembered thunder. Thousands of shell casings rolled around his feet, eddying like a brass tide as the Black Hawk and its crew waited. Rollins removed his hands from the minigun's handles, but his skin and bones still quivered from the vibrations of firing 4,000 rounds per minute in a steady flow down into the parking lot. He reached up to his face and, with clumsy fingers, pushed his goggles up onto his forehead. His eyes burned from the smoke, but as he blinked, he could feel wetness on his lashes. It wasn't sweat, and he knew it. Rollins wiped at his eyes with the backs of his trembling hands. Below was a scene conjured in hell itself. The parking lot of the elementary school was littered with the dead. A few of them whole, most of them destroyed, torn apart by the relentless plunging fire from Rollins's Black Hawk and the other gunships. But what drew Rollins's eyes and pulled tears from them was the figure that lay twisted into a scarecrow sprawl by the back door. It was a tall black man, or it had been. A man dressed in the uniform of a police officer. A man who had been infected. A man no one and no science could save. But he hadn't turned yet. That was clear to Rollins and probably to everyone. The man had come out of the school leading a staggering line of sick and injured people. All infected, all dying, none of them dead yet. Another cop, a woman, had tried to pull him back inside. Rollins could tell from her body language that she was screaming and fighting to pull the male officer to safety. However, another man, a white man, dragged her away and forced her inside the school. Two of the uninfected getting clear, leaving the others outside, leaving them to die. The cop had stood his ground, and as the zombies closed around him, he fired and fired and fired. It was the most heroic thing Hap Rollins had ever seen in 12 years as a combat vet. The man had to know that there was no hope. None. So why did he fight? The answer huddled behind him against the now closed door to the Stebbins Little School. A little girl. Other little kids. The cop fought like a wild man to keep them safe from the monsters, to make sure that their last memory was not of being consumed, to protect them from that while he waited for the big black insects in the sky to end it all with bullets. Rollins had been in the best position to fire on the black cop and the kids. The orders came. The killing began. The dying began. And the tears. Now the infected were dead. All of them. The dying and the risen dead. All of them littered on the pavement and splashed against the walls of the school, against the building designated as the town emergency shelter. Rollins was not a deeply educated man, but he understood the concepts of irony and farce, and tragedy. He wanted to look away from the torn body of the cop and the smaller ragdoll figure of the little girl. Wanted to. Couldn't. On some level, Sergeant Rollins felt that it would have been a sinful thing to do. Disrespectful. Then the helicopter began moving, rising and turning, pulling him away from the evidence of such hurt and harm. As it went, Hap Rollins hung his head and prayed to a God he was absolutely certain had turned his back on this world. Chapter 4. Pennsylvania National Guard Field Command Post, inside Stebbins County. Major General Simeon Zetter watched the live feeds on the screens of the 4 laptops set side by side on the big table. Around him, the other officers under his command watched in utter silence. No one spoke. All Zetter could hear was the tinny sound of helicopter rotors from the laptop speakers and the labored exhalations of the men and women around him. Everyone was panting as if they'd all run up a steep hill, even though all they had done was watch. The voice of a Black Hawk pilot suddenly cut through the stillness. "Zero movement," he said. "Spotters observe zero movement on all sides of the target." The target was the school. On the screen, 4 M1117 armored security vehicles entered through the main gate as machine gunners behind the fence kept watch. The M1117s split and each one began rolling along one side of the school. The vehicles bounced over ragged pieces of the dead. "Confirmed," said the same voice. "Zero movement." Zetter heard several of the officers let out deep sighs. He reached for a microphone and gave a string of orders for his people to expand the ground search using the modified Desert Patrol vehicles. Lines of these dune buggy-like 2-man vehicles vanished into the surrounding woods and neighborhoods, going where the heavier and clumsier Humvees couldn't. Then Zetter sat back and let out his own sigh. He got to his feet and turned to the gathered officers, all of whom fell silent. "This is a tragic and terrible day in American history," he said. "We have all been asked to make hard decisions and to carry them out with professionalism and efficiency." The officers nodded. "You are all aware of the political delicacy of what has happened today." More nods, but now they were careful. There were 3 huge elephants in the room with them, and nobody wanted to talk about any of them except the infection. That was safe ground because it was why they were there. The president and the governor of Pennsylvania had mobilized the Guard to stop the spread of an old Cold War bioweapon that had been released accidentally by a former Soviet scientist. That was, by strict military parlance, a clusterfuck. And the pathogen's virulence was such that it spread throughout the town, infecting virtually everyone, killing them. And then, in a twist of mad science that even Zetter found hard to accept, it brought the dead back as aggressive disease vectors. The risen dead, driven by the genetically engineered parasites that made up the substance of the pathogen, attacked like sharks, mindless, endlessly hungry, and vicious. That resulted in the second elephant in the room, the one each of them knew would haunt their lives and taint the military here on the ground and the administration in Washington. Acting under orders to sterilize the town in order to stop the spread of the infection, Zetter's command predecessor, Lieutenant Colonel Macklin Dietrich, had ordered the town's emergency shelter, the Stebbins Little School, to be destroyed. It was filled with people, many of whom were infected. Every officer understood the necessity for that kill order. Most of them even agreed with it. However, a reporter, Billy Trout, from Regional Satellite News, was inside the school. Inside but connected to the outside world via a live news feed. As the gunships opened up on the building, Trout made an impassioned plea to the world to save the uninfected children. The plea hit every single news service. The media and public outcry was immediate and massive. Massive. And that directly led to the ugliest part of this, at least for the officers in that command center. The reporter's plea was broadcast to the troops outside the building via the school's public address system. The result? One by one, the soldiers at the fence stood up and refused to follow orders. They would not kill the children. It was mutiny, and one officer, a young lieutenant, tried to nip it in the bud, but he was overwhelmed and eventually, outranked as a more senior officer, Captain Rice, went to stand with the mutineers. The president had immediately ordered General Zetter to relieve Dietrich of his post and assume overall command of the situation. Every officer there knew that it was unfair to put the blame on Dietrich, just as it was unfair that the public and the media would demonize them for their actions in Stebbins County. Actions that, had they not been taken, would have opened the door to a massive and perhaps unstoppable pandemic. That was the biggest elephant in the room, and nobody there dared talk about it. Now another chapter had been completed. Zetter had contacted the reporter and 2 police officers inside the school and made them a deal. If they sent out every infected person, then the school would be spared. It was a bad deal, and everyone, inside and outside the school, hated it. But it would play well in the media, as well as something like this could play. Zetter looked at each of his officers and read variations on this story in each pair of eyes. He grunted softly and nodded.
"Y'all have your assignments," he said. "Let's finish the cleanup so we can all go home."
The officers stood to attention, crisply, silently, and with absolutely no trace of expression or emotion on their faces. Zetter couldn't blame them for not wanting to show anything to him. He was the hatchet man for the administration, and that administration would be looking for more scapegoats to sacrifice on the altar of public outrage. It was how the politics of warfare worked, and it was how that worked, probably going back to Alexander the Great. When he was alone, Zetter sat down and sagged into his chair, feeling all of his years and more that he hadn't earned. He knew that once this was over, he was as done as Dietrich. Done and gone. He wasn't even sure he minded. Not after a day like today. He reached for his phone and punched in the number that direct dialed the White House Situation Room. The Chief of Staff, Sylvia Ruddy, answered the phone and then put it on speaker.
"Mr. President,"
said General Zetter,
"we have contained the outbreak. It's over."
Chapter 5. Good Night's Motor Court, Fayette County, Pennsylvania. Dr. Herman Volker parked his car in one of the vacant slips outside of the small motel. He turned off the engine and sat for nearly 10 minutes, watching the rain hammer down on the windshield. The sluicing water blurred the glass and transformed the neon sign above the office into an impressionist painting, all pinks and greens. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his eyes, blew his nose, and then tossed it onto the seat. Then he opened the door and stepped into the downpour. He wore trousers, a dress shirt, tennis shoes, and a blue sweater, and he looked like the tired, defeated, sad old man that he was. His feet barely lifted from the ground as he shuffled toward the door, pulled it open, and went inside. He carried no suitcase or overnight bag. The only thing he brought with him was his wallet, and it took him a long time to organize his thoughts well enough to fill out the information sheet given to him by the bored night clerk. He paid for the room with his credit card, took the key, and walked outside again. His room was on the same strip where he had parked. Volker used the key card to open the door, went inside, closed the door. He sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the ugly painting on the wall, an artless mess that was supposed to remind people of Joan Miro. But it didn't. Not in any way that lifted the soul. The doctor stared at the painting for a long time. Chapter 6. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. At first, they could only sit there, huddled against the wall, locked in each other's arms, beaten mute by horror, wrapped in their cloak of shared grief. Time was fractured, and each second seemed to expand and stretch, refusing to end, refusing to pass. Des kept repeating JT's name over and over. Was it a plea or a prayer? Trout couldn't tell. Then suddenly Trout felt a change in Des. It was a subtle thing, but it was there. One moment she was empty of everything except her pain, and then he felt her body change. Her muscles tensed. No, that was wrong. It was more like they somehow remembered their strength. She straightened in his arms, and her clutching hands gripped him and pushed him slowly but inexorably back. He resisted for a moment, then let her create that distance between them. Unnecessary distance for her, he was sure of it. And in that space, Des Fox reclaimed the personal power stolen from her by disease pathogens, guns, and betrayal. There was a final moment of intimate contact, when their faces were inches apart. Des was flushed, her face puffy from weeping, her eyes red and filled with pain. Then he saw the blue of those eyes become cold and hard and unforgiving. Her full lips compressed into a tight line with just a hint of a snarl. Trout knew that look, and he was fully aware of how dangerous she was when her mouth wore that shape and her eyes were filled with that much ice. So he eased back, releasing his embrace, shifting his body toward the wall and away from her. There was one heartbreaking moment, though, where he saw that she was aware of his allowance and acceptance of her power, and how he withheld his own. Des gave him a single, tiny nod of shared awareness. Then she got to her feet. It took effort, and it took time, but when she was standing, Des towered over him, and he sat there in her shadow, looking up at her. "We have to make sure the kids are okay," she said in a voice from which all emotion had been banished. Trout wondered what it cost her to affect that much control.
"Yes," he said. "And we have to search the building again." "Okay."
She began to turn.
"Des,"
he began, but she held up a hand.
"No,"
she said. Then she began climbing the stairs. No. Trout wondered if she thought he was going to say something about JT's sacrifice. Something encouraging about how the kids inside were safe, or something more personal, something about what he felt. He knew that what he had planned to say was that he'd do whatever she needed him to do, to help however he could. But he wondered if those were the words that would have actually come out of his mouth. Des hadn't thought so. Maybe, he thought as he got heavily to his feet, she was right. "Damn," he said aloud. He patted his pockets and realized that the satellite phone Goat had given him was somewhere upstairs. He needed to go get it, to tell Goat what just happened, to have Goat tell the world. This is Billy Trout, reporting live from the apocalypse. There was more truth to tell, more of the story he needed everyone to know. Maybe it would help. Trout was past knowing that, or anything for certain. Aching in body and heart, Billy Trout lumbered up the stairs after Des. Chapter 7. Tunnel Hill Road, Stebbins County, Pennsylvania. Corporal Lonnie Silk was sure he was dying. He could feel the warmth leave him, running in lines inside his trousers, down his legs, pooling in his shoes. The bleeding wasn't as bad now, but he didn't think that was a good thing. As his daddy used to say, you can't pour coffee from an empty cup. And he felt so empty, of blood, of breath, of everything, like God was rolling up the whole world to throw it in the crapper. It was like that. The rain-swept street was all harsh whites and blacks in the stark illumination thrown by the headlights of abandoned cars and businesses, with all the lights turned on but nobody there. The glow gave everything a harsh look, like crime scene photos in old newspapers. No soft edges, even with the rain. Lonnie knew that he was a dead man, would be a dead man soon. The captain had told everyone in his platoon about the infection, about how it worked, about what it did, about how there was nothing anyone could do. Nothing except die. And how fucked up was that? How crazy. How impossible. His legs needed to stop moving. Then he collapsed against the corner of a burned-out store at the corner of Tunnel Hill and Dull Factory Road. Across the street was the hulking mannequin factory that had given the road its name. The windows were smashed out, the parking lot littered with the blackened shells of cars and bodies. A car stood alone in the middle of the intersection, its radio playing. He moved on, stumbling down the long blocks, splashing through puddles. Some were filled with dirty rainwater. Some were viscous pools of dark red. There were so many bodies, all of them sprawled in a sea of black blood. Thousands of shell casings stood like tiny islands. Weak sunshine and dying firelight gleamed on the metal and winked on the rippling surface of that dark lake. No wind stirred the surface, though. Lonnie knew that for sure, and it was one of the things that made dying feel worse, more deeply terrifying. The black blood was alive with worms. Tiny, white, thread-like, so small that they looked like thin slices carved from grains of rice. But there were so many of them. From where he stood, Lonnie couldn't see the worms, but he knew they were there. The worms were everywhere. Everywhere. He could feel them, on him, in him, wriggling through the ragged lips of the bite on his arm, twisting and writhing inside the lines of blood that ran crookedly down his body. He tried not to look at the wound. He could not bear to see the things that moved inside it, around it. He could feel that wound, though, and even that was wrong. The bite was deep. Skin and muscle were torn. It should hurt. It should be screaming at him with the voices of all those torn nerve endings. Instead, it was nearly silent, cold, distant, as if the skin around that bite was no longer connected to him, no longer belonged to him, as if it was on him, but not of him. Cold emptiness ran outward from the wound, tunneling through his body like threads of ice. Every minute he felt more of the cold and less of the warmth he needed to feel. With every step he knew that his desperate heart, his pounding heart, was pumping that infection throughout his body. Cold blossomed like small, ugly flowers all over him, taking him away, stealing his awareness so that he wasn't even sure he could feel himself dying. Would he slip away completely and not be aware of it? The captain had said something about that. And that guy on the radio, the reporter trapped inside the Stebbins Little School, what was his name? Billy Trout? He'd said something scary, something that was crazy wrong. That the self, the consciousness, the personality, the everything of the victim didn't die with the body. Instead, it would be there, hovering, floating, aware but no longer in control of the meat and bone that had been its home. "Please," said Lonnie, asking of the day, of the moment, of anyone or anything that could listen. "Please." He did not want to die like this. He didn't want to become something sick and twisted. He didn't want to be a ghost haunting that stolen home of flesh and blood. Above him, somewhere up there, hidden by the buildings, he could hear helicopters, Blackhawks, Vipers, Apaches. And way above them, the growl of jets carrying fuel air bombs, waiting to turn the whole place, the whole town, into hot ash. 40 minutes ago, Lonnie Silk would have screamed and run at the thought of that fiery response to the plague. Now he looked to the heavens and prayed for it. It was better to burn on earth than be damned here. Hell here, heaven later. "Please," he said to the sounds of salvation that flew in formation above the storm clouds. "Please." But there was no one and nothing to help him. Lonnie turned and headed along a side street toward the edge of town, trying to go home. Chapter 8. Office of the National Security Advisor, the White House, Washington, D.C. Scott Blair, the National Security Advisor, wanted a drink so bad his skin ached. He was not normally a drinking man. A few martinis at a State Department dinner, a beer after 18 holes, but now he wanted to crawl into a closet with a bottle of bourbon and chug the entire thing. Instead, he opened a drawer, removed a bottle of Tums EX, shook 10 of them into his palm, and then shoved the entire handful into his mouth. Everything was spinning. His head, the room, the media, and maybe the world. The actual world. All because of a tiny shithole town in an inbred part of Pennsylvania no one gave a damn about. Not in any strategic sense. The devil is off the chain. That was how it started, for Blair and for everyone. The director of Central Intelligence called the president to forward an urgent message from a non-entity named Oscar Price, a CIA handler whose only job it was to babysit retired Soviet defectors. How hard could it be to keep tabs on a bunch of old men? Instead, one of Price's charges, Dr. Herman Volker, a former Cold War scientist, had taken an old and classified bit of science and turned it into what could only be described as a doomsday weapon. Doomsday. There was a time in Blair's life when that concept was a ludicrous abstraction, a scenario to be considered with no more reality than something cooked up by a Dungeons and Dragons games master. Except now, this wasn't a role-playing game for nerds. It was the most important issue to ever cross Blair's desk. Perhaps the most important issue to ever cross the desk to fall under the umbrella of national security. A doomsday weapon. Conceived by devious minds, funded by a desperate government, constructed in covert labs, and then brought to America by a defector who was long past the point of relevance. And given a name that was far too appropriate. Lucifer. Blair wondered if that kind of name was too close to actually tempting fate. It felt like a challenge, or an invitation. All Price had to do was keep the old prick out of trouble until old age or the grace of a just God killed the son of a bitch. But then that message came in. The devil was off the chain. That was how it started. A flurry of phone calls, teams of investigators put into the field, and the machinery of control and containment put into play. Except that nothing was controlled, and Blair did not share the president's confidence in General Zetter that this thing was contained. His desk was littered with intelligence reports. The latest on the storm, satellite pictures and thermal scans of Stebbins County, casualty estimates, and projections of how bad this could get if even a single infected person made it past the Q zone. This wasn't swine flu or bird flu or any other damn flu. It was a genetically engineered bioweapon driven by parasitic urges that were 1,000,000 times more immediate and aggressive than those of a virus, though equally as encompassing and indifferent to suffering. Every infected person became a violent vector. Everyone exposed to the black blood was likely to become infected, even if they were not bitten. The larvae in the infected blood clung to the skin and would find an opening, any opening. A scratch would do it. There were response protocols. Of course there were. Politics floated on a sea of paper, so there were reports for everything. There were reams of notes on the Lucifer program, tens of thousands of pages. And right now, virologists and microbiologists and parasitologists at the Centers for Disease Control, the National Biodefense Analysis and Countermeasures Center, and over a dozen bioweapons labs were poring over those protocols and the accompanying scientific research records. The protocols prepared after Volker's defection were very specific, coldly alarming, detailing in precise terms the consequences of inaction or insufficient action. There was, in fact, only one possible outcome of a Lucifer outbreak. Doomsday was no longer an abstraction. Blair made a series of phone calls to get the latest on the hunt for Volker. With each call, his heart sank lower in his chest. The bastard had vanished. He'd walked out of his house, got in his car, and disappeared from the face of the earth, taking with him the greatest hopes of understanding his variation of the pathogen. Lucifer 113, the version loose in Stebbins, did not precisely match the profiles of the old Cold War version. It was much faster, much more aggressive, and the reanimation of the dead victims took place in seconds. Seconds. It would mean that in any confrontation with a group of infected, the newly bitten victim would become an aggressive vector, a combatant in a twisted way, while the fight still raged. Apart from the obvious tactical disadvantages, that scenario created a devastating psychological component. When soldiers would be required to suddenly fire upon their fellow soldiers, doubt and hesitation would be born, and many more would die. It was a nightmare. It was surreal. His secretary tapped on the door, poked her head in, and waggled a sheaf of papers at him. "Mr. Blair, the speechwriters have a draft of POTUS's address. They want you to take a look at it."
"Good. Let me see it."
She crossed to his desk and handed him the speech. "This is unusual, asking for your input on a speech."
"Usual was last week, Cindy."
He bent over the speech. But Cindy lingered. "Sir, the word is that they stopped this thing. That's true, right? I mean, this is just winding down now." Blair raised his head and looked at her for a long time, saying nothing. She finally retreated from him and fled. He wished he had something comforting to say to Cindy. However, he liked the woman and didn't want to lie to her. Blair read through the speech, making disgusted sounds at the ends of nearly every paragraph. The speech, written by well-intentioned people who lacked a clear perspective on the problem, took the wrong tack, focusing on a response to Billy Trout's impassioned and ill-considered internet tirade. Blair felt the president needed to go in a radically different direction. And not only in terms of the speech. General Zetter in Pennsylvania kept trying to convince the president that the devil was back on the leash, that the situation was contained, which, as Blair viewed it, was a criminally distorted view of the facts. He grabbed a red pencil and began hastily redrafting it. Chapter 9. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Billy Trout went to the auditorium to find his camera. It lay on its side among the debris. Less than an hour ago, the big multi-pane windows that lined the east wall had been obliterated by machine gun fire as attack helicopters fired on the school. Trout looked at the damage and shivered. Tens of thousands of rounds had torn the window frames apart, showering the big hall with millions of fragments of glittering glass and jagged wood. The bullets had carved away at the bricks, leaving a gaping maw through which cold winds blew the relentless rain. The kids were all gone now, moved to other rooms so their wounds could be tended to. It was a freak of happenstance, the only real luck Trout could remember in that long, bad day, that none of these kids had been shot. He couldn't even work out a scenario that explained it. A quirk of physics, a bizarre collision of angle, the storm winds, uncertain targeting, the slanted floor with its row of seats, and who knew what else. But the kids were alive. Not okay, not all right, merely alive. Trout skirted the main floor, which was nothing but bullet-pocked detritus, and made his way to the stage where he had left his camera and satellite phone. They were beaded with rain, but when he tested them, they still worked. Another stroke of luck. And it made him wonder about the perversity of whatever gods there were that small luck was afforded them, while on the whole, the fortunes of Stebbins County seemed to have gone bad in the worst possible way. Shaking his head, he took his gear backstage and found a small office with a desk. Trout cleaned the camera lens, wiped off every last trace of moisture, and set the camera's tripod on the desk. He tested the mic and the signal. Then he called Goat to make sure that this message would go out as smoothly as the others. The satellite phone was routed directly to Goat's Skype account. The phone rang and rang. Goat never answered. Trout checked all of the connections. Everything seemed to be in order. He called again. Nothing. just the meaningless ring with no answer. Screw it, he thought. He'd record an update anyway and send it to Goat. Maybe his friend was ordering a refill at that nice, warm, safe goddamn Starbucks. Or he was in the nice, warm, safe bathroom taking a leak. I am gonna let Des kick your bony ass, Trout promised as he clipped on his lavalier mic. He hit the record button and set himself in front of the camera. This is Billy Trout, reporting live from the apocalypse, he began, then shook his head. I know how that must sound. If you're anywhere but here, it's probably pretentious and corny, but not from where I'm sitting. Right now, I'm in a small office near where the military fired on 600 children a few minutes ago. Since then, we've reached a kind of détente with the National Guard. They offered us a deal. We had to gather all of the sick and wounded people, anyone who showed any signs of infection from Lucifer 113, and we had to take them outside. That's right. Out where the monsters are. And we had to leave them there. Men and women and children. He paused and wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Children. I still can't believe that we did it. Does that make me a war criminal too? Did I help staunch the spread of a deadly pathogen? Or did I participate in a heinous act of brutality? I honestly don't know. I don't know. The camera kept recording, but Trout had to take a moment to collect himself. One of the people who went out there was a good man, a good friend, a Stebbins County police officer named J.T. Hammond. I want to tell you about him. I want you all to know about him, about how decent and kind he was, how strong he was, how courageous he was. Trout then told the camera about what J.T. did, about how he was infected, and how he made a stand with the children. By the time he was done, tears were streaming down his face, and there was a tremolo in his voice. He sniffed and collected himself. And now what, America? We have 800 people in this building. 200 adults, the rest kids, ranging from kindergarten through middle school. We have a few guns and some ammunition, probably not enough. This place is the town's emergency shelter, so we have food, water, cots and blankets, first aid equipment, and other basic necessities. Enough to provide for 300 people for 2 weeks. Yeah. Stop for a moment and do the math. He had to control his anger because rage wanted to make him say the wrong thing, then punched the buttons to send it to Goat. Technically, Goat should have been streaming it straight out to the net, but Trout wasn't sure. He tried calling him again and once more got nothing. He thumped the phone down in frustration. And that's when he saw her standing there. Des. She was pale and ghostly in the shadowy hallway, her blonde hair hanging in rat tails, her uniform torn and dirty, her blue eyes filled with pain and tears. But her mouth. Despite everything, Des was smiling. "Thank you," she said so softly that he almost didn't hear her. "For what? I don't know if that even got out." Des shook her head and stepped into the room. "I heard what you said about him. About J.T. Trout began, then said simply, "He was my friend, too." Des reached for him, and he took her into his arms. They kissed for a long time. It was hot and wrong, and her lips tasted of tears, but he absolutely did not want to let her go. Then she leaned back and looked at him, studying his face with eyes that were filled with questions. "I'm sorry," she said. He did not dare ask for what. There was so much wreckage behind them. Years of trying to make a relationship work and years of failure. Sometimes spectacular failures. Like the last time. For now, he didn't care what she was sorry for, or if it really related to him at all. He nodded and kissed her again. Then, after a long, sweet, oddly gentle time, Des pushed him back, turned, and walked away. Once she was gone, Trout leaned against the doorframe and stared at the empty hallway.
"I love you,"
he said to the shadows.
"And I'm pretty damn sorry, too."
Chapter 10. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. No one spoke while Billy Trout talked about the slaughter of the infected, the devil's bargain made with General Zetter, and the death of J.T. Hammond. When it was over, the president rubbed his hands over his face.
"Well, that should pretty much bury all of us,"
he said. "Actually," said Scott Blair, "we're the only people who have seen that video, the only ones who ever will." The president stared at him.
"What?"
Blair cleared his throat. "We shut down the cell and landlines and are doing focused jamming operations on satellite phone service. Our guerrilla newsman isn't talking to anyone anymore."
"Did I authorize that?"
Blair spread his hands. "I believe it falls under the umbrella of national security, sir." The chief of staff, Sylvia Ruddy, leaned close to the president. "We'd better run this past the Attorney General. We may be on thin constitutional ice here." "National security," repeated Blair very slowly, focusing it on Ruddy so even she could grasp the concept. "Cutting Trout off could backfire on us," said Ruddy. "The public already thinks we're killing citizens." "We are," said the president. "But a blackout would heighten paranoia and throw gasoline on the public outcry." "Let it," said Blair. "We've already been vilified. That damage is done, and when the president addresses the nation, we'll be able to manage a great deal of what the public perceives. Without Trout being able to release fresh messages, his veracity will collapse. We'll make sure that happens. What we have to do now is manage the official information we need to release regarding Stebbins and regain the public's trust." "There's no trust left," said Ruddy. "Trout pretty much killed it with his first lie from the apocalypse speech, and he has Dietrich on tape making threats." "Trust is fickle, Sylvia," said Blair dismissively. "We're in a crisis. We need control, not friendly smiles." Ruddy leaned close to the president again. "A blackout now would drive the last nail into your credibility." The president drummed his fingers very slowly, one fingertip at a time, on the table. His presidency already teetered on the edge, and he doubted there was enough spin control left in the world to repair the damage done. If that was the case, then all he had left was his legacy. So, how did he want to be remembered? He cleared his throat and glanced at Scott. "It's my understanding that Trout was using a satellite to get his messages out." "Yes, sir." "To whom? Was he streaming directly to the net, or we believe he had outside help? Someone on the other side of the Q-zone. Whoever that person is, he's very clever, and it's likely he has either background as a hacker or has hacker friends." "What are we doing to find this person?" Blair smiled. "Every agency in the alphabet is looking. We will find him. Or them." "And what about Dr. Volker?" Trout mentioned that the doctor gave him the research notes. "Yes, sir. Dr. Volker confirmed that when he spoke with Oscar Price, his CIA handler. He put everything on a set of flash drives and gave them to Trout." "Jesus," said Ruddy. "As protocol blunders go," said Blair, "it boggles the mind. Naturally, we are looking for Dr. Volker. Forensics teams are tearing apart his office at the prison where he worked and his home." "Where is he?" asked the president. "Can't we find the man?" "We are looking, Mr. President. Every possible resource is in play." "Will we find him?" "I have no doubt we'll find him," said Blair. However, we should consider the obvious alternative, which is getting those drives from Billy Trout, said Blair, by any means necessary. Chapter 11. Bordentown Starbucks on Route 653, Bordentown, Pennsylvania. Goat looked through the windows at the storm. The night sky was still black, but the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. From where he sat, he could see the lines of red taillights and white headlights on the highway. He wondered how many of those travelers knew what was happening. Probably all of them by now. The story was everywhere. It was the only story on the news right now, and Goat suspected that half of those oncoming headlights were reporters trying to get to Stebbins while the story was still breaking. He had already seen ABC, CBS, and CNN vans come through. He trolled the online real-time news. Fox was the first to pull the word zombie out of the info dump of the Volcker interview. Zombie plague in Pennsylvania. Goat snorted. It sounded like an SNL skit. Wasn't funny at all. He looked down at the clock on his laptop. 10 minutes to 1 in the morning. It wasn't even 24 hours since this thing started. It felt like a year. The night had been so goddamn long. As soon as he had gotten to the Starbucks, the first thing Goat did was to download the files from the flash drives Volcker had given Billy and emailed the contents to himself at several accounts. He copied the email to Trout and their editor, Murray Klein. He wanted to send the stuff directly to the other media, Huffington Post, Daily Beast, Rolling Stone, all the others. But Billy had suggested holding off on that. It was their only hold card in case the feds tried something. Which they would inevitably do, mused Goat. He wondered what he would do if he was in their place. Would he kill to make the situation go away, to hide the blame? Would that protect the public and prevent a panic? Goat wasn't sure. Ethical issues like that seemed clear until you were standing up close. Then all perspective became skewed. He hoped he would have the moral courage to do the right thing, but that opened a door to concepts of greater good and what that might actually mean. It was so hard to think it through and come up with a workable plan. The president was scheduled to speak soon. Originally, the word was that POTUS would address the nation at 3:30 in the morning, but the speech was moved up to 1:30. On any other day, that alone would be highly weird for a presidential address. A lot of people here on the East Coast would be asleep. The West Coast would be in the last hour of prime time. However, Goat didn't think anyone but the most abjectly stupid, indifferent, or uninformed would be sleeping or watching sitcoms. And it wasn't just the nation watching this story. The net proved that the whole world was watching. A couple of hours ago, most of the world, hell, most of the state, had never heard of Stebbins. Now Goat knew that it would become a part of the common language. You'd be able to say Stebbins the way you said the Towers or the Boston Marathon, and everyone would know what you meant. Stories like this changed the world, if not in fact, then in perception, by gouging a marker into a page of history. Days like this, events like this, were hinge points on which history turned. This story was about to blow up even bigger. The president and everyone in his circle had one chance to win this thing back, and that was to own it, take the bullet, and while they were still in office, do what they could to prevent further spread of Lucifer 113. Essentially, they could save the world without filtering that through their own political self-interest. Goat didn't believe in Bigfoot or the Easter Bunny either, so he figured that wouldn't be the way the White House would play it. It made him wonder where the line was between cynicism and clarity of vision. Goat sipped his coffee and smiled at what was about to happen. Despite all of the pain and loss and the deaths of so many people he knew, there was a dark and dirty part of Goat's mind that murmured disappointment that things didn't go completely south at the Stebbins Little School. Billy's previous speech, which Goat had streamed live to all of the news services, had made it impossible for POTUS to allow the National Guard to destroy the school and sterilize the town with fuel-air bombs. From here on, the story would roll forward on wheels greased by the political blood of everyone whose head would roll, and on the public outpouring of grief over the thousands who had died from the infection. But the story was becoming past tense. The kids at the school, now rescued, would become a symbol, a talking point, a voting influence at the next election. On the other hand, a couple of hundred kids being shot to death and then burned on national TV, that story would keep going, keep running, keep shouting for everyone to pay attention and react. And he, Goat, would be the conduit for that story to get out to the world. He was already part of the story, but if they wiped Stebbins off the map, then he would be the story, the only survivor, the fearless cameraman who'd gotten the truth out, getting footage while the world burned around him. He would be the most famous journalist on Earth, immediately and irrevocably. Had the story gone that way, gone that far. Now it looked like it would break in a different way. There were already posts claiming that the Stebbins thing was another internet hoax, that Billy Trout was a liar, that he was some kind of grandstanding fruitcake, and even that he was a cyber-terrorist. Goat wondered how much of that was genuine disbelief or White House spin-doctoring. Maybe a 50-50 split? Either way, this was brewing into a mother of a story. He murmured the words impeachment and Pulitzer, and he liked how each of them tasted on his tongue. But then he felt a flash of guilt. He hated that he thought about this thing, that he wanted it on some level. He had wanted it then, and he wanted it now. And there was a flicker of remorse nibbling at his soul that he knew he would always secretly regret the way it had played out. Goat opened Skype and punched in the number for Billy's satellite phone, but a message window popped up. No signal. He tried it again, making sure he got the number right. Same message. "Oh, shit," he murmured. The last message from Billy said they were going to take the infected outside. Since then, nothing. What was going on? Had they gotten to him? Had the helicopters come back? Goat's fears said yes, but his gut told him no. There was something wrong, but he didn't think Billy was dead. Not yet. He was, however, absolutely positive that the government was screwing around, that it was responsible for this silence. Cursing under his breath, Goat turned toward the counter to ask the barista if the router was down. Headlights flashed in his eyes as a car pulled into the lot. Goat flicked a glance through the window. A metallic green Nissan Cube. Ugly. Same make and color as the one he had seen parked in front of the house of Homer Gibbons' old Aunt Selma. It made him think of that, and how it all started. Then his mind ground to a halt as the driver's door opened and a man got out. A tall man, bare-chested despite the cold. A grinning man with a tattoo of a black eye on each flat pectoral. This was impossible. Goat wanted to scream, but he suddenly had no voice at all. He wanted to run, but he was frozen in place. The man walked the few steps between car and door in an awkward fashion, as if his knees and hip joints were unusually stiff. Goat's fingers were on the keyboard. Almost without thinking, his fingers moved, tapping keys as the bare-chested man pulled open the door and stepped into the Starbucks. The few remaining customers turned to look at him. The barista glanced up from the caramel macchiato she was making. She saw the bare chest and the tattoos. She saw the caked blood and the wicked smile. The man stood blocking the door, grinning with bloody teeth. Goat's fingers typed 8 words. The barista screamed. He loaded the address of the press and media listserv into the address bar. The customers screamed. Goat hit send. Then he, too, screamed. In Bordentown, Homer Gibbon, quarantine failed. It's here. Chapter 12. Communications Command Post Number 2, Stebbins County, Pennsylvania. It's working, sir, said the radio specialist. The captain in charge of communications for the National Guard detail on the eastern edge of Stebbins County was a small, fussy-looking man with the face of a geek. Even with the uniform, he didn't look like a soldier, and in his own heart, he wasn't. He was an electronics nerd who joined the Army to get free training and to play with more interesting toys than he could afford working at Best Buy. The unit in which he sat cost more than $30 million, and it was his. More or less his. The captain leaned over the specialist's shoulder and looked at the gauges, dials, and meters, then down at the digital readout on the computer monitor. It was arcane to anyone who didn't live and breathe electronics. To him, it was a language he understood better than English, a language that was precise, without ambiguity. The information on all those meters told him that no communication signal was getting into or out of Stebbins, except those on very precisely fixed channels. The blackout was immediate and complete. Stebbins County went dark, taking with it the border towns of Portersville, Allegheny Falls, St. John's, and Bordentown. All landlines, cell towers, and Wi-Fi were silent. No cell phones, no landline, and no damn satellite uplink. Everything was being jammed. He smiled. Good, he said, as he reached for the phone to tell Scott Blair that Billy Trout wasn't reaching anyone. Not anymore. And neither was anyone else. Part 2. Broken Dolls. It is dangerous to be right in matters on which the established authorities are wrong. Voltaire, The Age of Louis XIV. Chapter 13. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Trout tried Goat a dozen more times and hit the same wall every time. Then he went looking for Des and couldn't find her. Disturbed and depressed, he drifted back to where the kids had been gathered. It was uncomfortably subdued for the number of young kids there. Coffee? Billy Trout turned to see one of the younger teachers, Jenny DeGroot, holding a tray on which were a dozen paper cups. Steam rose and clouded the petite woman's glasses and put a flush on her cheeks. Trout fished for her name. Thanks, Jenny, he said, and took a cup. She nodded, and he stepped out of the way as she entered the big classroom. He hadn't liked the glazed look in Jenny's eyes. Too much shock, not enough hope, way too much fear. It made him wonder what was in his own eyes. He sipped the coffee and winced, not because it was hot, but because it tasted exactly like reconstituted horse urine, possibly the worst coffee he had ever tasted, and he'd worked in a newsroom for 20 years. He caught Jenny watching him from across the room, and Trout hefted the cup in a salute and pretended to smile in appreciation of the taste. A second sip only confirmed the bad news from the first taste. Horse urine with just a hint of hog feces. Maybe not as tasty as that. He drank it anyway, standing in the doorway to the art room. The classrooms on this floor had been separated by partitions, but they'd all been pushed aside to create a space nearly as big as the auditorium. Even so, it was crowded. J.T. had estimated 800 survivors, but Billy had done his own count. The math was both more and less encouraging. There were 843 people here. But that was all there was left of the population of Stebbins and its surrounding villages. 843 alive. more than 7,000 dead. Or whatever passed for dead, now that the world didn't make sense anymore. Infected, he told himself. It was a much safer word than zombie. He sipped the bad coffee. Inside the combined classroom, hundreds of children were huddled into groups, their bodies wrapped in blankets or coats. The surviving teachers and other random adults, school staff, a few parents, and stray survivors sat with them, trying to give comfort when there was no comfort left to give. Everyone in that room, Trout knew, was in shock. Some were in denial. Some were completely broken. Across the room by the teacher's desk, a man in a business suit sat holding a little girl and rocked back and forth. Trout knew him. Jerry Dumfries. The little girl, though, was the youngest of the Gilchrist kids. Trout had no idea where Jerry's daughter was. She attended this school, but she wasn't here in the room. She had to have been at the school, though, or on one of the buses. That thought, that knowledge, was dreadful. He watched Jerry rock back and forth with the girl. His eyes were nearly unblinking, and he kept murmuring the same snatch of song over and over again. A piece of a lullaby. Something old, but something that was as broken as he was. Only a piece of song. The lyrics, mangled and mostly forgotten, the tune stretched thin by repetition, like a piece of old cassette tape that had been played so long the emulsion was wearing off. Trout wondered if the girl heard any of it. Neither of her parents was here, nor were her two brothers. Her eyes were fixed and focused, looking out at the world, but he was absolutely sure, seeing and hearing none of it. Broken. Both of them. Like so many others. Even before the military had opened fire on them, these kids and the adults were teetering on the edge. The infected had attacked the buses, had dragged hundreds of kids out and torn the life from them. Parents and teachers had fought to protect their children, but as they succumbed to bites, they became the very things they had tried to stop. They had become the monsters that preyed upon the children. Trout prayed to God that no trace of the original personality was left in any of the living dead, though he knew that his prayer was a hopeless one. Yesterday he and Goat had interviewed Dr. Herman Volker, the former Cold War scientist, now working as a prison doctor, who had created the Lucifer 113 pathogen. Volker had told him that his latest version had been intended as a way of punishing convicted serial murderers. Volker's sister and her children had been savagely killed by such a monster in East Berlin long before the wall fell. Volker had spent years working as a Soviet scientist, ostensibly serving the state, but actually developing his ultimate revenge. The pathogen, based on genetically altered parasites and a witch's brew of chemicals, kept the consciousness alive even after the body died. It was Volker's desire that any prisoner executed for mass murder be conscious of his fate, even while his body rotted in the grave. It was a horrible punishment, though had it only been used on its intended subjects, in this case the serial killer Homer Gibbon, Trout might have privately wished Volker all the success he could get. But that's not what happened. Gibbon was infected with the pathogen during his execution by lethal injection, but instead of going immediately into a numbered grave on the prison grounds, a previously unknown relative had come to claim his body. Aunt Selma. Many years ago, Selma had helped her heroin-addicted sister take the infant Homer to a shelter. At the time, Selma considered taking the baby and raising him herself, even though she was the madam of a whorehouse. She did not, however, and instead Homer went into the system, going from one foster family to another. Some of those families cared for him, but others abused him. The abuse happened too soon, too early in Homer's life to give him any chance of normalcy. In that meat grinder of a system, a true monster was born. Homer earned his conviction and his sentence, and no one was going to mourn him. Except Aunt Selma. Driven by regret, by the last spark of her conscience, she claimed his body with the intention of burying him on the family farm where he might have some rest after a life in hell. But the pathogen was already at work. Homer's mind was alive in the dying body. And the parasites that made up the substance of Lucifer 113 were alive too. Alive and hungry. They kept his mind alive. They woke him up, and they awakened in him a hunger that was unlike anything nature could ever have created. Trout was only now putting the pieces together of what happened here in Stebbins. He knew from Des Fox that Doc Hartnett, the town's mortician, had been killed along with Doc's cleaning lady. Both of them reanimated, though, and from what Des said, the first victims of Homer Gibbon did not demonstrate any awareness of self or recognition of other people. They were mindless monsters. Zombies, to use Dr. Volker's word. And yet, the doctor had insisted that the pathogen kept the consciousness alive, that in each of those zombies was a kind of helpless passenger, aware of what his or her hijacked body was doing, but totally unable to exert control. All it could do was feel the flesh rot and witness what the body did. It was the most horrible thing Trout had ever heard. And it was loose in Stebbins County. It had consumed the town of Stebbins. As he stood there, looking at the traumatized man holding the traumatized little girl, he wondered what had broken each of them. Was it simply the shocking deaths of the people they loved? Certainly that would be enough. Or was it worse? Had they looked into the dead eyes of their own family members, wife, children, siblings, parents, and somehow saw the screaming ghost of the people they knew, trapped like victims behind the windows of a burning building? Had they seen that? Billy Trout prayed that was not the case. He knew that if, God forbid, anything happened to Des, if she was infected and became one of those things, and if he looked into her beautiful blue eyes and saw the person he loved there, trapped in the body of the monster she became, he didn't know how to even think about that without screaming. But he knew what he would do if such a thing happened. He wouldn't run. And he certainly couldn't take the headshot that would bring her down. No. Trout was absolutely sure he would simply drop whatever weapon he held, that he would stop fighting, that he would let her take him. Slowly, Trout backed out of the doorway and turned away. He wandered down the empty hall, careful not to step in any of the pools of disease-blackened blood, mindful of the tiny larva that wriggled in the mess. He kicked shell casings away with shuffling feet. When he reached the end of the hall, he stopped and leaned against the wall. The satellite phone hung from his belt, and he removed it and once more punched in the number for Gregory Goat Weinman. The phone rang and rang. Goat did not pick up. From down the hall, through the open doorway to the art room, Trout could hear sobs and the eerie echo of a broken man singing a broken lullaby to a broken little girl. Billy Trout leaned his back against the wall and closed his eyes and tried to think of a way out of this. Chapter 14. The Oval Office, the White House, Washington, D.C. Scott Blair was admitted to the Oval Office and was pleased to find himself alone with the president. "You made your changes?" asked the president, holding a handout for the speech. I did, Mr. President. He handed over the papers and waited while the president read through it. Then POTUS removed his glasses and sat back in his chair to appraise him. This is what you want me to say? This is what I think needs to be said. What about the Trout video? Our people are tearing it to pieces online. By morning it won't be any part of the official story. What about the popular story? We'll manage it and we'll weather it. The president smiled. You're beginning to sound like Sylvia. God forbid, thought Blair, but managed a bland smile. We have to protect the administration if we're going to win this. We beat this, Scott. Not sure why everyone else thinks so, and you don't. Because I don't have my head up my ass, he almost said, but managed to think it through first. Instead, he said, I know you and Simeon Zetter are friends, and I know you trust him implicitly. Understood. I, however, do not trust anyone implicitly. It's my job not to make assumptions. Are you saying that's what I'm doing? I'm saying that's what everyone is doing, Mr. President. We are all in shock because of this, and we are all cognizant of the implications of last night's events. Heads will roll here in Washington, even with the spin control we're using. Heads will have to roll. Dietrich will take the most heat, but everyone knows that a soldier follows orders. Unless we intend to crucify him as a rogue who exceeded all authority, including a presidential order, which would put him in jail, then we'll have to hang others out to dry. That's a political fact. The president shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he did not disagree. But all of that is secondary, Mr. President. I can't stress enough how strongly I believe that this matter is not over. General Zetter isn't Stebbins, Scott. You're not. Neither are you, you officious moron, thought Blair. Sir, Blair began slowly, but the president cut him off. I'm not ordering another attack on Stebbins. I understand that, sir. But to put it quite simply, Simeon Zetter is nearing the end of his career, and even though he was formidable in the field once upon a time, I think now he's become more of a politician than a soldier. He is supporting you and your presidency. I don't know that I entirely trust his assessment of the situation in Stebbins, because we have to accept the possibility that he is wrong about containment. We must, absolutely must, get Dr. Volker's research notes. I thought you said we'd find Volker. We will. But we haven't yet, and every minute we spend looking is time not spent preparing for contingencies. The president considered, nodded. Did you have something in mind? Yes. Trout has that research on Volker's flash drives. Sir, I would like to stop right there, Scott. I know what you want to do. You want the guard to storm the school and take those drives away from Trout. I won't do that. What I have done is order General Zetter to obtain the drives. This he will do. End of discussion. Blair wondered if he could throttle the president before the Secret Service could stop him. Now, is there something else you'd like to discuss, Scott? Asked the president. Yes, sir, said Blair tiredly. But it concerns General Zetter. If I may speak candidly. The president steepled his fingers. Go ahead, he said guardedly. I think we need an independent assessment of the state of things in Stebbins County. We need unbiased eyes on the defenses, the deployment of resources. We need someone who has experience in ultra-high-profile biohazardous situations, which, by the way, no one under Zetter's command has. We need a diagnostician, not a general practitioner. The president pursed his lips, considering the point. Do you have someone in mind? Yes, said Blair. There's a man we both trust, and he's already in the area. Who? Blair gave him the name. I think you'll agree that he's well suited for this particular assignment. He's also available and close. I could have him and a small team inside the Q-zone in 20 minutes. The president gave him a calculating smile. He just happened to be in the neighborhood? No, sir. I called him yesterday and told him I needed him in the on-deck circle, just in case. And he's there to observe, assess, and report only, is that correct? Yes, sir. Nothing else? No, sir. I would take it amiss, Scott, if I found out that your pet shooter was there to do an end run around Simeon Zetter. It would pain me to learn that he and his team put so much as a foot inside the Stebbins little school. You understand me when I say that. We're clear? As glass, Mr. President. They studied each other, both wearing small smiles, both watching the other with cold eyes. "Very well, Scott," said the President. "Send him in." "Thank you, Mr. President." "Scott," said the President with a gentler smile, "take a breath. This is over. We won. We saved the country, and you played your part. Be proud." "Yes, sir, I am," lied Blair. Chapter 15. The Oval Office, the White House, Washington, D.C. Sylvia Ruddy, the President's Chief of Staff, came in as Blair left. "Scott looks like he's about to explode," she observed. "Is he still trying to nuke Pennsylvania?"
"Firebomb," corrected the President. "But no, not at the moment anyway."
He told her about the flash drives. "He wanted to send a team after Trout?"
"I nixed the idea."
"Good."
"However, I am letting him send a team in to do an independent evaluation of the integrity of the Q-zone."
Ruddy made a face. "Simeon won't like it."
"Simeon works for me. He doesn't have to like it. Besides, I actually do want to know. Scott's right about one thing. We have to make sure we don't spike the ball before we're in the end zone. I want to believe this is over, but quite frankly, Sylvia, I'm scared out of my mind."
"So is everyone," she countered. "But don't let Scott drive you crazy. He's such an alarmist. He was an alarmist when he was the National Security Director, and he's an alarmist now. Maybe more so now. I told you that when you appointed him."
"Maybe. But he's been right more than he's been wrong."
"Sure, but when he's wrong, he's all the way wrong. And he's wrong on this. He's overreacting to a situation that now requires careful handling and a great deal of subtlety."
"I know."
"And yet you gave him permission to release the hounds?"
"Hardly that. Scott will do what he's told," the President said firmly. "He may have his issues, but he's still one of us."
He handed her Blair's amended speech. As she read it, her face went white and then dark red. "This isn't a speech," she snapped. "This is you begging to be impeached and indicted."
"I don't see it that way."
"No, Scott doesn't see it that way. He doesn't have to worry about re-election."
"There are more important things than winning another 4 years."
"Are there?" she asked. Chapter 16. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania.
"Oh, God! There's another one!"
Billy Trout wheeled around but had no time to get out of the way as half a dozen people came running straight at him. The lead man was one of the teachers, and he simply shoved Trout, and as Trout tried to take a step to catch his balance, his back flared and his right leg buckled. He collapsed to the floor, and half the people running down the hall tripped over him and went sprawling. It was like a bad comedy routine, except no one was laughing. Most of the people had weapons, guns, makeshift clubs, and fire axes. Everyone was ragged and dirty, streaked with grime, wild with panic. Trout scrambled painfully to his feet and grabbed the sleeve of the closest man, Bowers, the art teacher. "What's happening?" he demanded. Bowers was a frail, frightened man with eyes that jumped and twitched. "Down in the gym," he gasped. "I think it's Mr. Maines." Trout didn't know who Mr. Maines was. A parent of one of the children? A teacher? A refugee trapped in the school?
"Is he infected?"
Bowers's face, already pale, turned a sickly white. His eyes were jumpy with shock. They said he bit one of the kids." It felt exactly like being punched over the heart. Trout wanted to sag back against the wall, slide down, bury his face in his hands, and weep. He wanted this to end, to go away, to not be real.
"Show me," he said.
Trout heard himself say the words, felt his body launch into motion, felt his pulse quicken. But he did not want to see this. Not more pain. Not another kid. No way he wanted to see another infected kid. Another hurt kid. Another lost kid. But he heard himself growl as he snatched up a fire axe dropped by one of the men who had fallen. "Hey!" said the man, grabbing for it. But Billy ignored him and kept the axe.
At first, he followed Bowers. Soon, though, he simply followed the screams. Billy Trout ran down 2 flights of stairs. Each step shot an arrow of pain into his back. Earlier, when he and Desdemona Fox had fought their way across the parking lot to the school, Billy had picked up a heavy bag filled with guns and ammunition. He grabbed it the wrong way, though, and something had exploded in his lower back. The pain was awful, but it was also useful. It made him grind his teeth on it, to bite down on it, to say fuck it to agony and everything else. Fuck it to his rage at what was happening, to his terror, and to his grief. His fists were locked around the handle of the fire axe as he ran, but already he could feel fear sweat loosen his grip. Rage, he was discovering, was not a constant. It wasn't armor that he could wear until this was all over. If it was ever going to be over. The screams echoed upward from the basement, bouncing off the walls of the fire tower. Another one. That's what Bowers had said. That's what he was running to see. Another one. God. Another of the dead, and another child with a bite. The small knot of teachers and other survivors lagged behind him, their determination to reach the source of the screams diminishing with every step. Trout couldn't fault them, not one bit. After all, what in their lives had ever prepared them for something like this? They reached the basement and burst from the stairwell into the gymnasium, a big, damp, empty space that Trout remembered from humiliating dodgeball games when he was in the 5th grade. That had been his hell year, before the growth spurt that would give him the length of bone and quality of muscle he'd later use in high school baseball and track. The gym was linked to his memories of being a weird, shy, strange little boy who didn't have many friends. Des Fox had been his first real friend. When 2 older boys tried to pants Billy here in the gym, Des had beat the shit out of them. He'd been in love with her ever since. "In there," gasped Bowers, pointing. Only a few lights were on, pale cones of yellow that did little to push back the immense darkness. The screams were constant, high and thin. They tore through an open office door at the far end. "Please," begged Trout. "Not another kid. Please, please." The axe was heavy, and he knew he'd have to use it on Mr. Maines, whoever he was. There was no plan B for dealing with those who were so far gone that they had crossed over into what? Even now, Trout had a hard time calling it what he knew it was. These people were infected. These people were also dead. Technically dead. Essentially dead. And yet they moved around, some of them shambling, some running awkwardly, all of them chasing, hunting, grabbing, biting, eating. The dead consuming the living. Zombies. It was madness, and Billy Trout's orderly mind rebelled at it. Death was death, and the dead don't do this, can't do this. The screams told him otherwise. Despite the pain in his body and the agony in his soul, Trout ran faster. He was 6 steps from the gaping doorway when sudden light and noise exploded within. The deafening blast of a gun, the eye-hurting flash of shot after shot. Trout skidded to a sloppy halt, lost his footing in something wet, fell, slid all the way to the mouth of the open door. There was one last blast, one last flash. The screams stopped. Trout lay there on the floor. He could hear Bowers somewhere behind him, panting, mumbling something. Maybe a prayer. Maybe he'd simply gone fucking nuts. Billy wanted to. Something moved inside the office. A shifting of the shadows, the scuff of a shoe. And then a figure staggered out, lumbering, uncertain,
sagging sideways against the frame, clothes torn and streaked with blood, eyes dark and dead. Trout looked up into the face. "Des?" he whispered. Those dead eyes shifted toward him. Tears broke and fell down her dirty cheeks. The slack expression of shock disintegrated into horror and shame and grief. "Oh, Billy!" She sank down to her knees, the gun still held in one hand, but that hand was slack at her side, as if forgotten or disowned. Trout scrambled to his knees and gathered her in his arms as the first terrible sobs detonated within her. In the bad light, Trout could see the leg of a man, Mr. Maines, and the sprawled form of a child, lying tangled together in a pool of black blood. The smell of gun smoke burned in the air. He wanted to push her away. He wanted to turn away from what she had just done, what she'd had to do. But he loved this woman. And this, all of this, was their world now. So he held her close as she wept. As they both wept. "It's okay," he lied. "It's all going to be okay." Except they both knew that it wasn't. Chapter 17. What the Fink Thinks. WTLK Live Talk Radio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You're listening to Gavin Fink, and this is What the Fink Thinks, coming to you live from Pittsburgh. It's the middle of the night, but I don't think anyone within the sound of my voice is sleeping. The eyes of the world are on the town of Stebbins down in Stebbins County, right on the Pennsylvania-Maryland line. And why? Well, my friends, that depends on whom you ask. We all know that Stebbins was ground zero for Superstorm Zelda, a real B-I-T-C-H of a storm that picked up a lot of water from the Three Rivers and dropped it on the Mason-Dixon line. Sure, that's how it started, but then the cow patties hit the windmill, let me tell you. First, there were unconfirmed reports of a double homicide in Stebbins, but within minutes there were all sorts of wild rumors about a riot at a funeral home. But buckle up, kids, 'cause it was a fast slide down the crapper from there. The governor released a statement saying that there was an outbreak of a new kind of virus in Stebbins. Then the internet went. Gavin Fink took a long drag of his cigarette and winked at his engineer. I tell you, folks, I don't know what to believe. Tell the Fink what you think is happening on this dark and stormy night. He gave the call-in number, and before he'd even finished, the board lit up like a Christmas tree. Chapter 18. The Office of the National Security Advisor, the White House, Washington, D.C. After Scott Blair left the president, he hurried to his office. He blew past 3 of his aides, growled at his secretary to hold his calls until further notice, and closed his door. As soon as he was alone, he took his cell phone from his pocket, punched in a 5-digit code to activate a scrambler, and ground his teeth while he waited through 5 rings before the call was answered. "How'd it go?" asked the man at the other end. Blair snorted. "How do you think it went?" "Jesus," said the man at the other end. "Did you show him the math? Did he see the projection numbers if this thing breaks the Q zone?" "I did. But for all intents and purposes, that broadcast from the school cut his balls off. He's almost afraid to act." There was a pause. "Which means what?" I gave him an alternative suggestion, which is, "You, Sam," said Blair. "I told him I wanted to send you in." There was a brief silence at the other end of the line. "Go in and do what?" "Find out exactly what's happening in Stebbins. You and a small team. I want to know how bad things are there. However, you are not to report to General Zetter. He and everyone here in Washington is acting like the Super Bowl is over and we're all doing post-game chatter." "How's that make sense? Surely they read the same report you forwarded to me. This pathogen isn't a suitcase nuke. You can't defuse it and sit back for a victory cigar." "Preaching to the choir, Sam." "So what the hell's happening?"
Why the shift from move heaven and earth to win this to whatever the heck you'd call this shit? Is it that broadcast? Mostly. That was like being hit by a cruise missile. It cut everyone's balls off. There are people here who think that the attack on the school could be used to do more than bring down the president. They're afraid it's done permanent harm to the structure of government as we know it. I watched the president on TV. He did a pretty solid job of pissing on that video. Don't know if you watched the commentary afterward, but CNN, Fox, and even MSNBC are edging away from belief that Trout's video was the real deal. I know. But once the storm's over and the press actually gets into Stebbins, some of what Trout said is going to be verified. The school looks like it was fired on by machine guns. We can't change that, unless you blow it up. Hiding the body after a murder isn't the same as removing doubt about the crime. Blair blew out his cheeks. No, Sam. This is doing political damage. There's no doubt about it. But who the fuck cares? Growled Blair. How did we ever allow ourselves to get to the point where careers and political agendas matter this much? We are facing a doomsday scenario, and they're acting like it's the midterm elections. Doomsday, Sam. It's not even an abstract concept. It's right there, and we're handling it all wrong. And you want me to go in and what? Take photos of the gates of hell to prove their opening? Pretty much. Jesus. I need irrefutable proof that we're not on top of this, so I can force the president to respond the way we should have responded from the jump. Can you do that? I can try. Sam, I'll do it. Sam amended. How soon can you be on the ground there? Almost right away. I have some assets I can put into play. I kind of figured this was coming, and I tapped some friends who were in the area. You're already there? Not inside the Q zone, but close, said Sam. We're at a motel just outside. Me and 4 people I can trust. I anticipated this, Scott. Don't act so surprised. If I was off my game, we wouldn't be having this call. I knew I could rely on you. Yeah. Yeah, if the world doesn't end, buy me a beer. I'll buy you a brewery. Deal. Now, said Sam, if we're done with the bullshit, Scott, tell me why I'm really taking a squad of first-team shooters into the Q zone. Chapter 19. Farmlands Supermotel, Bordentown, Pennsylvania. Sam put down his cell phone and took a long breath, held it until everything inside his mind and body felt steady, then let it out with slow control. Both aspects of the job Scott Blair wanted him to do, the official and unofficial mission, were going to be a real bitch. Although Sam had run with a Spec Ops team for a long time, that was years ago. He hadn't fired a shot in anger in a decade. His technical skills were still there. On the rifle range, he was still one of the 2 or 3 top snipers in the U.S. military. But was he still fit and sharp enough to lead men into a situation like this? Had he lost a step getting to first base? Possibly. More important, could he do what Blair wanted him to do? Would he do it? Sam certainly agreed with the NSA advisor's logic and even, to a degree, with the plan, but it was ugly and it was risky. There were a lot of ways it could go wrong and very few ways it could all work out right. He took a second calming breath. And a third. Then he called the 4 members of his team waiting in rooms here at the motel. They were all seasoned special operatives. None of them were active military. Like Sam, they had retired to contract work, but also like him, their only employer had been Uncle Sam. Different groups within the government, and sometimes the agendas didn't quite mesh, but since they were freelancers, they could pick and choose their jobs. None of them ever wanted to follow an order they didn't like or couldn't square with their consciences. That adherence to a specific ethical code had earned the team the sobriquet of the Boy Scouts. Nice nickname, but far from the truth. People in special ops never felt entirely comfortable in, say, a confessional. Certainly not Sam. Sam caught his reflection in the mirror, bolted to the back of the motel room's door. The man he saw looked small, old, and guilty, even though he hadn't yet done anything except take a call from an old friend. But then he thought about what was at stake. He thought about his family back in California, his dad, his stepmom, his brother, and his infant half-brother. They were 3,000 miles away from this, but with something like Lucifer 113, distance wasn't a guarantee of safety. All it did was buy some time. Time before what? Before the inevitable, or something that might already be over. There was no way to know. No way to be certain. Except to gather his team, saddle up, and cross the Q-zone into Stebbins County. The one place on Earth that no one in their right mind wanted to go. "Fuck are you doing?" he asked himself. His reflection looked pale and sickly, and it offered no reply. Then Captain Sammy Mora stood up, reached for his gear bag, slung his sniper rifle over his shoulder, and headed out to war. Chapter 20. Bordentown Starbucks on Route 653, Bordentown, Pennsylvania.
"Please,"
he begged.
"Don't. Please."
Goat was crammed into a cleft formed by his overturned table, a couple of chairs, the walls, and a tourist who sat bleeding and weeping. He huddled into his niche, arms wrapped around his head, knees drawn up tight, as if the bones of his limbs offered some real protection for what was happening. The air in the Starbucks was filled with screams and prayers. And laughter. Low, thick, wet.
"Please,"
Goat whimpered. He thought desperately about Volker's information, uploaded to his email accounts, but not sent, not shared. And with sudden, screaming clarity, he realized that he and Billy had made a serious mistake. That information should have gone out. Goat's instinct had been to send it, but he hadn't. It was in attachments. It was just sitting there, as useless as he was. God. Despite the carnage around him, Goat cut a sly, frightened look at his laptop, which lay on the floor not 5 feet away. How long would it take to locate the email and forward it to the listservs of reporters to which he belonged? How long? 5 seconds? Less? That's all the time it would take to maybe save the whole fucking world. A handful of seconds. Goat felt himself begin to move, shifting away from his worthless hiding place, edging toward the laptop. Then the laughter stopped. "Hey," said a voice. "I know you." The world seemed to freeze around Goat, and for a terrible moment even the screams seemed muted, as if those words had flipped a switch on everything. Goat didn't look up, though, too frightened to risk acknowledging anything. "Yeah," continued the voice. "I seen you somewhere, ain't I?" Goat held his breath, refused to move. Then pain exploded in his thigh as something hit him with jarring force. A cry burst past the self-enforced stricture in his throat, and he rocked sideways, suddenly whipping his arms out like defensive stabilizers. Despite his need not to see this man, Goat's eyes opened, and there he was, standing right there, looming over him, bare-chested, ugly, covered in glistening red, eyes dark and wild, smiling mouth full of promise. "Fucking A, I knew you," said Homer Gibbon. "You were there when they killed me." Behind Gibbon and all around him was pain and horror. People were broken. Broken. Arms shattered, mouths gaping to reveal broken teeth, handfuls of hair torn out from customers who had tried to run but were one step too slow. Everyone was bloody, every single person. Some of them lay sprawled,
dead or dying. But even as he thought that, Goat knew he was wrong. Dying, maybe. Dead? Not really. Death, as Goat had known it his whole life until yesterday, was no longer a fixed point in reality. It was no longer a doorway that, once entered, could not be passed again. All of that had changed. Because of Dr. Volker. Because of something called Lucifer 113. And because of this man, this monster, Homer Gibbon. When Goat didn't answer, Homer kicked him again. Same spot, only harder. Gibbon wore no shoes, but he knew how to kick. And from the laugh that bubbled out of him, he enjoyed it. The way some kids like kicking cats. A small cruelty that spoke with disturbing eloquence about this man. Even if Goat had not known what kind of monster Homer was, even if Goat had not sat through weeks of testimony by clinical psychologists and forensics experts at this man's trial, he would have deduced important truths about him from that kick and its accompanying laugh.
"I asked you a question, boy," said Homer, his voice colored by an accent that sounded Southern but was pure rural Pennsylvania. "Want to see what happens if I have to ask you again?"
"Yes," stammered Goat.
"Yes, what?"
"Yes, I was there." Homer kicked him again, even harder. Goat screamed in pain and tried to turn away to protect the spot on his leg that now burned as if scalded.
"You was there when what?" demanded Homer.
"Yes," said Goat, in a small, fractured voice. "I was there when they killed you. At the prison, at the execution, I was there." Homer nodded in satisfaction.
"What's that make you? Some kind of news reporter?"
Behind Homer, one of the wounded people was crawling toward the door. Her shirt was torn, revealing a bra with little blue flowers on it. Most of her right shoulder looked like raw hamburger. Goat hadn't witnessed the attack specifically on her, but he recognized the bite. Even from 10 feet away, Goat could see a thick black goo mixed in with the blood, and in that goo, tiny thread-like worms wriggled. Dark lines ran crookedly from the torn flesh, delineating the pattern of her veins and blood vessels. Even though the bite had just happened a few minutes ago, the infection was spreading at incredible speed. So fast, thought Goat. It's happening so fast. It was nothing Mother Nature could ever have created. Nothing natural could spread infection at that rate. Lucifer 113 had been genetically engineered to be a perfect rapid-onset bioweapon, and the modified parasites took hold inside the bloodstream with all the deadly speed of a neurotoxin. Homer turned, following Goat's line of sight, and again there was the low, wet laughter.
"Fuck yeah," he said. "That's right. That bitch is one of mine now."
"One of yours?" asked Goat weakly. Homer turned back and then squatted down in front of Goat, arms dangling off the tops of his knees like a gorilla.
"You gonna lay there and tell me you don't know what's happening? You're a reporter, and you want to tell me you don't know what I done in Stebbins? You gonna fuck with me like that?"
"No." Homer reached out and patted Goat on the cheek. 3 pats, each one harder, so that the last one was a full slap that rocked the reporter back against the table. It was not as hard as the kicks had been, but hard enough, and Goat's head banged off the wooden table. He twisted sideways, once more curling into a fetal ball, collapsing against the side of the badly injured customer who had been sitting there, weeping and bleeding. It was then that Goat realized 2 very bad things. The first was that the man was no longer weeping.
or breathing for that matter. And second was that his eyes were open, wide open, staring right at Goat. Black mucus ran from between the man's slack lips. There was nothing in his eyes. No pain, no confusion over the way in which everything had suddenly gone wrong for him, no spark of anything. The eyes saw Goat, though. That much was certain. The dead man opened his mouth to show his teeth. Behind Goat, Homer Gibbon chuckled. "Look who woke up hungry," he said. He was still chuckling when the dead customer lunged at Goat, grabbed him by the shirt and hair, and pulled him toward those blood-streaked teeth. Chapter 21. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Desdemona Fox pushed herself back from Billy. The movement was abrupt, as if she'd suddenly reached the limit of the grief she allowed herself, though Trout knew it was more than that. People were watching. Civilians. And Des was the only person of any authority left, even if that authority no longer carried any official weight. There was, after all, no Stebbins County Police Department anymore. All of the other officers, and even all of the support staff, were as dead as the mayor, the town selectman, the director of public works, and the chief of the fire department. There was, in fact, nothing left of Stebbins except the small knot of people here and the real estate on which they stood. Even so, Des had to play her part. She knew, as he did, that her badge and gun, her uniform, and the personal power everyone knew she had formed the rails in a frail fence between order and chaos. If she lost it, then these people would likely lose it too. And if that happened, then none of the children upstairs had a chance. Not one chance. Des kept her face averted while she went through the mechanical process of removing the magazine from her Glock and thumbing in fresh rounds to replace those she had fired. She did not bother to pick up her spent brass. Everyone stood mute as they watched this, and when she slapped the magazine back into place, they all flinched. The face Des showed them as she holstered her gun was composed, hard, uncompromising, and totally closed. If anyone noticed the drying tear tracks on her face, they dared not mention them. Des nodded to two men who stood slightly apart from the group. "Bob, you and Luke get some of those big plastic trash bags from the kitchen. We have to wrap the bodies and get them out of here." The men stared at her and then passed her to the room where the killing had been done. They didn't move. "Now!" she snapped, and they flinched again. Bob opened his mouth, maybe to protest or maybe to ask a question, but then he caught the look in Dez's eyes and answered with a curt nod. He tapped Luke on the arm, and they turned and hurried across the gym floor. Des appraised the rest of the group. "Listen to me," she said in a quiet, dangerous tone. "The rest of you are going to search this place. Again. I don't know who searched down here, but because some assfuck didn't look in a closet or a closed office, another kid's dead. You hear me? Someone killed that kid, and I'm not talking about the dead son of a bitch who bit him. For now, I don't give a shit who searched down here, but we need to search this whole building again, and that means every nook and fucking cranny. You hear me? And if another kid gets hurt because one of you jerk-offs didn't do your job, then God help you, because when I get done with you, there won't be enough left to feed to the fucking zombies. Anyone think I'm joking? Anyone has anything to say about that? Say it now, and I'll shove it down your throat with your teeth. This isn't a debate. Now move!" They scattered like scared birds. As they moved away, Trout saw that their eyes were now filled with a different kind of fear. Not of the dead, but of the living. Of her. Everyone in town knew Des Fox. Most of the people in Stebbins didn't like her, and Trout knew that a lot of them wouldn't piss on her if she was on fire, but no one could say that she wasn't a good cop.
There were a lot of stories floating around town about how Des treated wife-beaters and child abusers. None of those stories were exaggerations, Trout knew. Add to that the things she had done here in the school. She and JT, her partner, mentor, best friend, father figure. JT was outside, his body infected by a bite and torn by heavy-caliber machine gun bullets. He had sacrificed himself to help clear the school of the infected, and he'd gone down fighting to keep the infected children from being mauled by the dead before the military could use their guns to end all pain for them. Trout wrestled with that, understanding on one level that the slaughter was necessary and even merciful in a twisted way, but on all other levels it was perverse. No matter from which angle it was viewed, the innocents were the victims. Now the last surviving children of Stebbins County were here in this building. No more of them should have died. The men hurried away, splitting into two-person teams, not saying anything until they were in the stairwell on the far side of the cavernous gym. All of them were bigger than Des. Most of them were tough, hardened farmers and factory workers. Some were even combat veterans. No one said a damn word to Des Fox. Des stood there and watched them go. Trout saw that her whole body was trembling, rage and pain. He wanted to take her into his arms again. That would probably earn him an ass-kicking, too. So instead he said, "Des, what do you want me to do? How can I help?" It took a long time before she reacted, as if she was off in some distant place and there was so much distance to travel to get back to where he was. Her head turned slowly until she faced him, but even then there was no immediate recognition in her eyes. She said, "What? How can I help?" he repeated gently. She began, but faltered. She shook her head. Then, without another word, Des crossed the big empty room and vanished into shadows. Billy Trout stood watching the emptiness of the open doorway to the stairwell. "Shit," he said softly. He found a chair and dragged it over to a spot near where the child and the dead Mr. Maines lay. He didn't want to see them, but he felt it was important to stay with them until Bob and Luke returned with their makeshift body bags. When he tried to understand this self-imposed vigil, he found no useful answers, no insights. He checked his sat phone to see if there was anything from Goat, but got no signal down here in the basement. It made him wonder how the story was spreading. Was it time to do another broadcast? "This is Billy Trout, reporting live from the apocalypse." That was what he had said. It hadn't sounded silly at the time. He meant it to be shocking. Now it sounded strange to Billy. It was less than 1 hour since the military attacked the school. And yet it felt like forever. Like he and Des and the others had always been here. Like this was one of those nightmares he sometimes had where he felt trapped in a twisted funhouse experience that never ended. Reporting live from the apocalypse. Shock tactics or straight reporting? The line seemed badly blurred right now. Goat had told him that the whole thing had gone viral, but Trout didn't know what that actually meant in terms of the survival of the people here and the handling of the outbreak. Was it all over? Was his part in it over? Trout was a career reporter, even though that career had dumped him back into his hometown of Stebbins. A one-stoplight dirt stain on the Pennsylvania map. Rarely had he gotten so much as a whiff of a significant story. Even his coverage of the execution of convicted serial murderer Homer Gibbon was not star-making. There were too many better-known reporters there. At best, the pieces he filed for regional satellite news were folded into stories by bigger and, very likely, better journalists around the country.
But now he was the story. And that was a paradigm shift so radical it stripped all the gears. He sat on the rickety folding chair, staring at the shadows, listening to the sounds of an old building settling into its own grave. He could still feel the dried tear tracks on his own cheeks. Somewhere beyond the walls of the school, out there in the black night, he could hear the heavy drone of helicopters, the menacing throp, throp, throp of their blades. "Ah, Des," he said softly. He thought about what this was doing to her, hurting her, aging her. Desdemona Fox was the most beautiful woman in the world to Trout. Tall, fit, powerful, blonde, with great bones and every curve on his personal must-have list. Curves he knew more intimately than anyone. Granted, he was far from the only person, or even the most recent person, to have explored that landscape, but he was the one who loved them and loved her. Not in that order. They'd been an item more times than he could count, and they'd both logged mileage in breaking each other's heart. The last time had been a doozy. He had proposed marriage, and the next day he walked in on her with a biker. That was her reply to the proposal. Classic Des. Why cross a bridge when you could burn it? Since then, she'd been a raging bitch to him. And to hear others tell it, she'd been a raging bitch to the whole world. Even more viciously defensive than normal, which was saying quite a lot. There was, however, a corresponding increase in her efficiency as a police officer. She wrote more tickets, arrested more drunks, broke up more bar fights, and kicked more ass than before, all of it with a nasty fuck-you smile on her pretty lips. Then the devil came to Stebbins County. Even now, Billy found it hard to reconcile the fact that his town was being destroyed by something conceived half a world away during the Cold War. It was spy movie stuff. It was horror movie stuff. He wondered what the death toll was here in town. 7,000 people had lived here. Were all of them dead now? Was that even possible? Add to that the kids bust in from neighboring districts and the parents who had come to get them out of the path of the storm. What was that? Another 1,000? Maybe 2? Someone else's madness had brought wholesale death to town. Except in Stebbins County, death wasn't death anymore. He put his face in his hands, not to weep, but to try and hide. Chapter 22. What the Fink Thinks. WTLK Live Talk Radio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Gavin muted the mic and hit the intercom. "How are we on calls?" "Oh, we have them lined up from here to next year," said Gavin's producer, happy with his kind of call-in volume. "Sending you a hot one now." Gavin Fink punched a button to take the call. "And we're on with Brenda from Harrisburg." "Hi, Gavin. Long-time listener, first-time caller." "Glad you picked up the phone, Brenda. So, tell me, what do you think is happening in Stebbins County?" "Zombies," she said. "Come again?" "Zombies." "You're saying zombies?" "Yes, zombies." "In Stebbins County?" "Oh, yes, they're all over Stebbins County." "Zombies?" "Zombies." "Okay. This is a new one even for What the Fink Thinks. Tell me, Brenda, what makes you think there are zombies at large in western Pennsylvania?" "My nephew told me." "Your nephew? And does he see zombies on any kind of regular basis?" "Oh, no, he's a soldier. He's with the National—" "Sorry, Brenda, I have to cut you off," said Gavin. "I'm being told we're going to have a statement from the President of the United States. Going live to Washington." Chapter 23. The Oval Office, the White House, Washington, D.C. "Mr. President," said the cameraman, "we're on in 5, 4. He finger-counted down the rest of the way and then pointed to the commander-in-chief, who sat at his desk, neat and tidy and severe. "Hello, everybody," said the president, his voice deep and sober.
There are two issues confronting us this evening. The first is the major storm that has developed in western Pennsylvania. This storm, now being called Superstorm Zelda, has exceeded the predictions made by the National Weather Service. The severity and duration of the storm has caught everyone by surprise. However, I just received a full briefing from our emergency response teams, including FEMA, and agencies that are going to be helpful in the response and recovery efforts. The Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Health and Human Services. Behind the teleprompter, Scott Blair nodded. He'd helped write this announcement, using his typical hands-on approach. The president had raised objections about much of the content, but in the end had been persuaded to handle things a certain way. In the way that Blair and the Joint Chiefs all agreed was the only way to keep the train on the rails. Obviously, continued the president, reading it verbatim, everybody is aware at this point that this is going to be a big and powerful storm, and that it is far from over. What were originally estimated to be a line of smaller cells moving behind the main storm front have taken an unfortunate turn and are strengthening. However, all across the region, I think everybody is now able to make appropriate preparations, and everyone is taking appropriate actions. I've spoken to the governors of Pennsylvania, Maryland, Ohio, and West Virginia. They have issued emergency declarations. Those have been turned around quickly here in the White House. We have pre-positioned assets so that FEMA personnel are working closely with state and local governments. We're making sure that food and water and emergency generation is available for those communities that are going to be hardest hit. But because of the nature of this storm, we are certain that this is going to be a slow-moving process through a wide swath of the country, and millions of people are going to be affected. Beside Blair, Sylvia Ruddy stood with her arms folded tightly across her chest, wearing what the French would call a moue of disapproval. Blair disliked her because she was far more concerned about party politics and the president's legacy than she was about actual national security. "So the most important message that I have for the public right now," said POTUS, "is please listen to what your state and local officials are saying. When they tell you to evacuate, you need to evacuate. Do not delay. Don't pause. Don't question the instructions that are being given, because this is a serious storm and it could potentially have fatal consequences if people haven't acted quickly." The president paused and gave the camera a 2-second beat of unblinking intensity. "But keep in mind that for folks who are not following instructions, if you're not evacuating when you've been asked to evacuate, you're putting first responders in danger. We're going to have search and rescue teams in and around multiple states all at the same time. And although we've got the Department of Defense all positioned, if the public is not following instructions, that makes it more dangerous for people, and it means that we could have fatalities that could have been avoided. Transportation is going to be tied up for a long time, and probably the most significant impact for a lot of people, in addition to flooding, is going to be getting the power back on. We anticipate that there are going to be a lot of trees down, a lot of water, and despite the fact that the power companies are working very closely with their various state officials and local officials to make sure they are bringing in as many assets as possible and getting those ready in preparation for the storm, the fact is that a lot of these emergency crews are not going to be able to get into position to start restoring power until some of these winds have died down. And because of the nature of this storm, that may take several days. So the public should anticipate that there's going to be a lot of power outages, and it may take time for that power to get back on." Blair glanced at his own copy of the prepared message. The groundwork was established, but the real game was about to begin. "Don't fuck it up," thought Blair, knowing the president's tendency to go off script. "Now we come to the second matter before us this evening," said the president, in a voice that changed from firm control to something approaching cold steel. "Many of you are already aware of reports of an outbreak of a new kind of flu virus. This outbreak was first reported in Stebbins, a small town on the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland. There has been some wild speculation in the press as to the nature and severity of this disease, and that speculation has sparked a rash of irresponsible and inaccurate posts on social media. Much of the information being shared about this outbreak is false, and some persons have posted faked videos and audio files purporting to be from reporters in that town." The president paused for effect, and Blair believed that everyone in the country paused with him, taking the same deep breath, holding it in their chests, waiting for the heavy punch that follows the tentative jab. "Those reports are false," said the president, with real edge in his voice. "And they pose a serious threat to the efforts of FEMA and the Centers for Disease Control. Reports like that are the worst kind of internet manipulation, and investigations are currently underway to determine if these posts are an attempt to deliberately disrupt our ability to provide effective emergency response. I can assure you that the substance of these posts are false, and I will promise you that the persons responsible will be found and prosecuted as cyber terrorists. It is abhorrent when a misguided or malicious few attempt to exploit a catastrophic event in order to further their own agendas, especially if that goal is at the expense of the American people. We will not allow them to succeed, and we will protect the people of this great nation." "Good. Nailed it, word for fucking word," thought Blair, and he wanted to fist pump, but didn't. The president almost glared at the camera. "Last point I'll make, though. This is going to be a difficult storm, but the great thing about America is when we go through tough times like this, we all pull together. We look out for our friends. We look out for our neighbors. And we set aside whatever issues we may have otherwise to make sure that we respond appropriately and with swiftness. And that's exactly what I anticipate is going to happen here. So I want to thank all the federal teams, state and local teams that are in place. I'm confident that we're ready. But I think the public needs to prepare for the fact that this is going to take a long time for us to clean up. The good news is we will clean up, and we will get through this. Thank you. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America." The camera lingered on the president's face for a moment, then cut to a place card of the presidential seal. "And we're out," said the cameraman. The president sagged back and closed his eyes. He looked as exhausted as Blair felt. It was nearly an hour into a new day, and they'd been at this since early yesterday. Blair knew that there was little chance any of them would get a moment's rest any time soon. They were all wired with caffeine and whatever prescription stimulants they each had in pockets or handbags. Even so, Blair smiled and nodded to himself, well pleased with the statement that had just gone out. He leaned toward Sylvia Ruddy. That was letter perfect. The chief of staff swiveled her head like a praying mantis and glared at him with absolute hatred in her eyes. "We're all going to hell for this," she said. Chapter 24. Over Stebbins County. Sergeant Hap Rollins crouched over the minigun and peered through the slanting rain at the endless rows of stalked corn eddying like waves beneath the rotor wash. "Anything?" The voice in his headphones was the pilot, Sully. It was maybe the 40th time he'd asked the question since they'd come out to the farm country. Rollins wished Sully would shut the hell up. If he saw something, he'd say so, and Rollins didn't see shit. Nothing human, anyway. Bunch of cows lying down to try and get out of the wind, and a few horses running free from an overrun farm. The farmhouse and outbuildings had already been destroyed by rockets. 30 or 40 times they flew over dead bodies lying on the road, or on lawns, or in the middle of fields. Dead bodies, not walking dead. Rollins was still processing that distinction. The officers wanted them to use the word infected, but most of the guys were calling them zombies, a word from old Bela Lugosi movies, a word from comic books and horror novels. Zombies. Rollins didn't like the word. Didn't like the way the word fit inside his head. It had too many sharp edges. It nicked the walls of his world view. And it didn't do anything good for his faith. Rollins was a Catholic, and the only dead that were supposed to be walking around were the ones Jesus raised. Like that little girl he said was only sleeping. Lazarus, too.
and J.C. himself. Only saints and saviors were supposed to be walking around if they were dead. Those were the rules, and Rollins didn't remember reading anything about infected ordinary dead people getting up and walking around biting people. That wasn't death, no matter what the mission intel said. That was something else. Something bad, sure, but dead people don't do what these people were doing. Even though Rollins believed in Jesus and God, he wasn't as sure about the concept of the devil. He knew he was supposed to believe that, and even though he could imagine a place where sinners went, his ex-wife and her boyfriend came to mind, a guy with hooves and horns directing traffic for lost souls was hard for a grown man to accept. He wiped raindrops from his goggles and leaned out to look down the rows of corn. Nothing. "We're good," he said into his mic, and he had to repeat it over the constant crackle of interference. Some of the guys said the communications team was operating jammers in the area. Collins could believe it. He had tried to call home to check on his parents, who lived in Pittsburgh, but there was no signal on his cell. That had been a couple of hours ago. So, jammers? Sure, he could buy that. "Let's go check out the other field," he yelled into the mic. "Looks like a pear grove. Come in low on the west side and we'll see if there's anything under the trees." "Roger that," confirmed the pilot, his voice fuzzy and distorted. The Black Hawk lifted away from the waving corn and began a shallow climbing circle. They were working with 19 other helos, quartering and searching the vast farmlands that filled this corner of the country. It was a crazy job, and Rollins, like everyone else, knew that it was pretty damn close to a fool's errand. There were 300 farms here, ranging from little postage stamp herb gardens to the fruit and vegetable groves that stretched for miles. There were 50 teams in various ground vehicles and a couple of hundred two-man patrols, and with all of that, it seemed like an absurdly impossible task to Rollins. Even so, there was plenty of radio chatter from the ground and the other Blackhawks, saying that they were finding spots to clean out. Infected, trapped inside locked cars. A whole bunch of them trapped inside the Y supermarket after downed trees knocked out the power. Some strays wandering through fields. Like that. The infection was out there, and the Q-zone seemed to be holding, but Rollins had his doubts. His buddy, Dave, who was a lot more Catholic than Rollins was, had confided to him that he was really scared by all this. Religious scared, not just regular scared. Dave couldn't understand why God allowed something like this. The dead to rise. Rollins told him, "This ain't God, man. It's science. This is weird science shit. It's the dead rising, man. No, just sick people acting dead. Like in that old movie, the one in London, 28 Days Later. It's only a disease." "No, man," said Dave, lapsing into a confidential whisper. "I think this is what they talked about in the Book of Revelation. The end times." Rollins started to grin at that, but the look on Dave's face killed that expression before it was born. "Come on, man," Rollins said mildly. "It's just like that anthrax thing. It's a disease, and that's all it is. Don't mess your head up by thinking bad thoughts." But Dave wasn't convinced, and Rollins didn't at all like the look in Dave's eyes. No, sir, he did not like that look at all. Kind of wild. Maybe a little crazy. He wondered how Dave was getting along. He was out working a checkpoint with their drinking buddy, Tito Rodriguez, out on the Q-zone line. The pilot came out of his turn and slowed as he dropped down almost to the level of the road. The rotor wash blew into the field and raised the skirts on the pear trees. Muddy water swirled upward, but Rollins had a clear enough view under the front 4 or 5 rows. He saw slender tree trunks, and between those— "Shit!" he said suddenly. "Got one!" There was a man there, dressed in farmer's clothes that hung in torn rags from his burly shoulders. His eyes and mouth were black, and as the helo edged sideways toward him, the man snarled and reached for him. Rollins took a small breath, let it out, wrapped around a small prayer to Mary, and pulled the trigger. The captain said to go for a headshot, but that didn't much matter when you fired a minigun. The heavy caliber bullets tore the infected apart, splattering him to the wind. The parts that fell no longer seemed to belong to something that had once been human, and the rain pressed the red detritus down into the mud. "Got the sumbitch," said the pilot, sounding happy about it. The feelings within Rollins were far less certain. "Anything else?" asked the pilot. "No," said Rollins, though he wasn't as sure as he sounded. The helicopter drifted along the farm road, blowing back the boughs of the trees, tearing half-grown pears from the branches, looking for more things to kill. As it flew, Rollins remembered the look in Dave's eyes when he said that he thought this was maybe the end times. Rollins mouthed the words of the prayer to Mary. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death," hoping that he was just being ridiculous, hoping and praying. Chapter 25. Operational Command Post inside Stebbins County. A young lieutenant knocked and entered the general's trailer just as Colonel Dietrich left. "Sir," said the young officer to Zetter, "we're still getting reports," he said, holding out a clipboard wrapped in plastic. Zetter took it, shook off the raindrops, and studied the data. 6 patrol helicopters had encountered infected, 2 of them within a mile of the Q zone. 16 ground patrols had also located and eliminated the walking dead. In all cases, the infected were eliminated without any of his people taking injury. No additional loss of life was reported. "And there's this," added the aide, handing over a second report. The general took it, and as he read, he felt his heart sink. He turned away in case his feelings showed on his face. Zetter stood there, considering the information in the second report. He sighed, read the rest of it, sighed again. "Damn," he said to himself. During the ground search, his teams had encountered 23 people who displayed no signs of bites or other injuries, and who did not appear to be in any way infected. 5 men, 7 women, 11 children. 2 of the children were babes in arms. The report was written in the way that such reports had to be written. All potential risks were removed with dispatch. Removed with dispatch. They didn't even use the word eliminated. Removed. "Is there a reply, sir?" asked the aide. "Just, proceed with the operation as directed," said Zetter. "Yes, sir." The aide left. General Zetter sat heavily in his chair and stared bleakly at the report. "God damn," he breathed. He considered calling this in to the White House. In the end, he did not. There was nothing new to report except that the cleanup was proceeding as anticipated. Proceeding, in fact, as something close to the best-case scenario outlined in the National Biodefense Analysis and Countermeasures Center protocols. "We're winning this," he told himself. "We're winning." Chapter 26. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. The president met with his advisors for an update and learned that nothing new was happening. That should have been comforting, but wasn't. He shooed them all out and told the Secret Service agents to make sure he wasn't disturbed for 10 minutes. They nodded like silent robots and pulled the door shut. The president dug into his pocket for a pack of Winstons and the gold lighter given to him as a gift when he agreed to visit a NASCAR event in Georgia. He kissed one out of the pack, popped the lighter, leaned into the flame, inhaled all the way down to the bottom of his feet, and sank back into his leather chair. He held the smoke inside, enjoying the way the menthol changed from cold to hot in his lungs, and then blew a long stream of blue smoke at the ceiling.
On the big TV screen, there were half a dozen windows showing various views of General Zetter's efforts to clean up Stebbins County. Gunships filled the rainy skies. Armored personnel carriers were laden with guns of kinds he couldn't name, some of which he'd never seen. The president was a lawyer and career politician and had never served. Not that it mattered, because many of his predecessors hadn't either. Not everyone could be JFK. He tried to understand the military, though, and felt he had a good grasp of its philosophies. He knew the big-budget technology, of course, the drones and missile programs, the fleets and the last jet fighters. All of those were big-ticket items that were constantly in the press. As he watched a line of soldiers in hazmat suits deploy from the back of a troop transport, he made a mental note to become more familiar with their gear, with the things they had to carry into fights like this. He took another drag, wishing for a moment that he was back in college and hitting a blunt instead. That was a long time ago, and he hadn't gotten high since junior year. Now seemed like a good time. Maybe it would take the edge off. Or maybe not. He remembered the paranoia that sometimes accompanied the high, and he sure as hell didn't need any more of that. As he lifted the cigarette to his lips again, he studied his hand. It was shaking. Had it done that during the meeting? He wasn't sure. Was it relief that the crisis was over? At least everything except the spin control. Or was it something else? Was Scott Blair right? Were the generals right? Except for Zetter, they all agreed with Blair. So what did that mean? The president punched a button on the table. "Yes, Mr. President?" asked his secretary. "Doris, get General Zetter on the line. Private call." "Right away, Mr. President." It was just that. In less than a minute, Zetter was on the line. "General," said the president curtly, "are you alone? And is this a secure line?" "Yes to both, sir," said Zetter. The connection was still weak and static-filled because of the high-intensity jammers. "Good. I'm alone as well, Simeon, so this is just the two of us. What I want is the bottom line. No politicizing, no padding or fluff. I want to know the absolute truth about where we stand in Stebbins County." There was a very small pause at the other end of the call. "We're in good shape, Mr. President," said Zetter. "However, with the storm strengthening, we could use more men. Have there been any fresh sightings?" Another pause. A little longer this time. "There are scattered sightings, sir, but each encounter has been satisfactorily resolved. How's the line holding?" "We're confident that the Q zone is absolutely solid," Zetter said. "There have been no incidents at any of the checkpoints, and we have satellite and helicopter surveillance, as well as roaming patrols and spotter planes. A mouse with a head cold couldn't get out of Stebbins." "Simeon," said the president, "I need you to be absolutely sure about this." "I am, sir." Another hesitation. "However, we could really use the extra troops. National Guard, reservists, or regular Army, any or all. The more boots we have on the ground, the tighter the lock, and the quicker we can put a button on this whole matter." "Very well. Send your requests to Sylvia Ruddy, and I'll sign the order and make the necessary calls right away." "Thank you, Mr. President." "Of course. And, Simeon." "Sir?" "I appreciate you stepping in to take control of this situation." "Doing my job, sir." "I know that Mac Dietrich is your friend. If there was time to have someone else ask him to stand down, I would have made that call." "He's a professional soldier, sir. He understands, as do I." But there had been one last little hesitation before Zetter said that. The president took a long drag, considering the implications of that pause. He exhaled slowly. "Simeon, there's another matter that you need to be aware of." He told Zetter about the flash drives believed to be in Billy Trout's possession. "That's a wrinkle," Zetter said slowly, clearly unhappy with the news. "It is. Do you want me to iron out that wrinkle?" Gently.
You have a relationship with the police officer in the school, Desdemona Fox?
We spoke. It wasn't, as you can imagine, a comfortable conversation for either of us.
Will she talk to you again?
I believe so.
Good. Do so, and ask her, and I mean that, Simeon. Ask her for the drives.
I could send some of my people into the school to have that conversation, Mr. President.
In front of 800 witnesses? Do you think that's the best move?
No, sir.
No, agreed the president. If, as you say, the situation is under control, then there is no immediate need to escalate an already tense situation. A pause.
Very well, sir.
Let's repair bridges, not burn them.
Of course, Mr. President.
Though, the president said, drawing it out with feigned casualness, have some people on standby, just in case. Always good to be prepared for eventualities.
I agree, sir.
Thank you, General. Keep me apprised. And disconnected the call. He sat in silence, looking through the smoke at the images on the screen, eyes narrowed, brain working, hands still trembling. Chapter 27. What the Fink Thinks. WTLK Live Talk Radio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We have Mary from Philadelphia. Go ahead, Mary, you're on the air. What do you think is happening in Stebbins County? It's not aliens, said the caller. Glad to hear you say that. It's definitely not aliens. So you say. Want to tell the listeners what you think is going on? It's the Chinese. Chinese Americans? No, the Chinese. The government of China, Gavin.
In rural Pennsylvania?
That's where it starts. It starts off the radar. It starts right in the heartland. The Chinese already own America. Gavin signaled the producer for more coffee. This was going to be a long night. Tell me how they're planning to do that, Mary. It's the Asian bird flu. That's what's killing people. The Chinese have sent agents over here to release their flu, and you know we don't have anything that can stop it. Why is that, Mary? 'Cause it's Asian. The coffee arrived, and Gavin took the flask from his briefcase and added 2 fingers of early times. Definitely a long night ahead. Chapter 28. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Des Fox ghosted through the empty halls of the Stebbins Little School. Her Glock was in its holster, her hands empty of everything except promise, her heart heavy with shame and grief. Every once in a while she paused and cocked her head to listen to the old building. Even the silence was not silent. With buildings this old, there was always some sound. The faint hum of the battery-operated clock mounted high on the wall, its glass face covered by a heavy wire grill, the creak of timber and stone as the building settled, the faint banshee whistle of wind clawing its way in through broken windows upstairs, the muffled sound of children weeping beyond classroom doors at the other end of the hall. No new shouts, though. No screams and gunfire. She was positive, though, that she could hear the discordant pounding of her own heart. Without warning, the walkie-talkie clipped to her hip squawked. The sound tore a cry of alarm from her. "Officer Desdemona Fox, please respond," said a voice clouded by harsh static. "Officer Des snatched up the device and keyed it. "This is Fox," the voice said. "Officer Fox, please hold the line." "Is this some kind of trick?" asked Des, but the voice didn't reply. Another voice spoke, one she hadn't heard before.
"Officer Fox."
"This is Fox. Who's this?"
"This is Major General Zetter."
"Glad you remembered that we're alive, General."
"Is Mr. Trout with you?"
"No."
"Can you put him on the line?"
"What is this about, General? If you're thinking of trying to change our deal, then you can shove that right up your—"
"It's my understanding that Mr. Trout is in possession of a set of flash drives belonging to Dr. Herman Volker. Are you aware of this?"
"Yes," Des said carefully, though she knew that Billy didn't have the flash drives. Goat did, but Des didn't want to say so to Zetter. and definitely not without talking to Billy first.
"Are you aware of what's on those drives?"
asked the general.
Abso-fucking-lutely.
"We would very much like to get our hands on that information, Officer Fox."
I bet you would. And I bet that 1 minute after you got them, you'd shove a Hellfire missile up our asses. No thanks.
"This isn't a trick, Officer Fox."
Uh-huh. And the check's in the mail. I'll call you in the morning, and I won't come in your mouth.
"Officer Fox,
do you really expect us to believe anything you say?"
you have been given assurance on behalf of the President of the United States that no further attacks will be made on the school as long as you follow the safety protocols."
"Right. Tell that to the Sioux."
"What?"
"As much as it causes me physical pain to say this out loud to another, what I assume is another Republican, our government doesn't have a great track record for keeping its promises with people who have something they want."
"Kennedy, Democrat,"
said Zetter. "What?"
"I'm a Democrat. It may surprise you that there are plenty of us in the military, Miss Fox."
"Whatever. You get what I'm saying? You know there's not a lot of trust going on here."
"I suppose that's an unfortunate truth. But given that I was no more involved in making treaties with the Indians than I was behind the attack on the school, how about we avoid making assumptions that might confuse the situation? And it was I who ordered our troops to stop firing on the school."
"Oh, blow me, Zetter. Billy Trout's broadcast hit the news services and the president's nuts crawled up inside his chest cavity. That's what happened. He told you to stop trying to kill us only because it would look really fucking bad at the next elections. If you're going to try to pretend otherwise, then this conversation is over."
Zetter took a moment with that.
"Fair enough,"
he said.
"We don't see things from exactly the same perspective, but I take your point."
"Which leaves us where, General?"
"In the middle of a grave national crisis. Everything else aside, all bullshit aside, Officer Fox, the infection is still out there. Contained for the moment, but still out there. Still a major threat. You know that this is a bioweapon, one designed by Cold War scientists and then redesigned by Dr. Volker. If we stand any chance of eradicating it, then we need to have his research notes."
"Why the fuck are you bothering us about this? Go ask Volker for them."
"If that was a possibility, officer, we wouldn't be having this conversation."
"Meaning what?"
"Meaning that right now we can't locate Dr. Volker."
Des felt the floor tilt under her.
She staggered into one of the classrooms, checked that it was empty, leaned against the wall, and slid down to the floor.
"Officer Fox?"
Didn't he leave any records?"
"None that we have so far been able to find,"
said Zetter. "How the hell are you idiots allowed to run a country? I should have voted for a clown college. They'd at least have a reason for being this stupid."
"I don't want to debate politics, Officer Fox. We need what's on Mr. Trout's flash drives."
1,000 thoughts raced through Des's head. None of them were good. Most were way across the line into paranoia, but she felt justified in thinking every one of them.
"Tell you what, General," she said. "How about you do this? How about you airlift us the hell out of here? Take us to Pittsburgh or Philly or somewhere other than where people are eating each other. How about you do that and then we can talk about the flash drives?"
"You know we can't risk that. You have to understand that."
"Sure. Have a nice day, General. Thanks for calling."
"Well, wait."
"What?" she barked.
"We can't take you out. You have to understand that. We don't know enough about this disease to guarantee that it's safe to bring you out. Until we look at Dr. Volker's research notes, we don't know all the ways in which this thing can be communicated. We have concerns that anyone coming into close contact with the skin or blood of one of the infected might be at risk. We don't know if someone can carry the infection without developing obvious symptoms. There are a lot of things we don't know, and until we do, we need to keep you in isolation. Surely you can appreciate the severity of this. Surely you can understand the necessity of—"
Okay, yeah, I get it. Fuck.
"So letting us have the flash drives is the quickest and surest way to help us understand this enough so that we can get you out of there."
"I get the logic, General, but pardon me if I don't trust your motives worth a wet shit."
The general sighed.
"Is there something else I can do for you that would encourage you to do the right thing here?"
Fuck you, Officer Fox. No, General. Fuck you and that asshole in the White House, and fuck everyone else who had a hand in this. Fuck all of you. All of you. Am I making myself clear? Is any of that getting through? You deserve to burn in hell.
General Zetter's response caught her totally off guard. He said, "No." A sob broke in Dez's chest. She squeezed her eyes shut as tightly as she could, wincing at the effort not to see anything, even her own thoughts. "You killed him," she said.
"Who?"
asked Zetter sharply, clearly alarmed.
"Is Mr. Trout?"
"Not him, you douchebag. You killed J.T.
"Who is that, Officer Fox? Was that a friend of yours?"
"Patrol Sergeant J.T. Hammond, Stebbins Police. A good man, a family man, a decent person who only ever cared about other people. You maniacs killed him."
Zetter said,
"Was he the officer who went outside with the other infected?"
"Yes."
It hurt Dez to say that one word. Zetter cleared his throat. "I saw what happened to him. I saw what he did. He protected the children from the infected. Officer Hammond died a hero."
Dez banged the back of her head against the wall.
"J.T. was murdered and you bastards killed him. Now you want us to spread our legs and let you fuck us."
"That's not how it is, officer."
"Yeah," she said. "It is."
Neither of them spoke again for several burning seconds. Then Zetter said, "We need those flash drives."
"If you try to take them, General, I'll burn them. You can come in here with guns blazing and you won't find shit. But I can promise that every single thing you do will be streamed live to the net. The world's watching, General."
"Officer Fox," said the general, "be careful not to overplay your hand. You might not have as many good cards as you think. I'm trying to work something out we can both live with, and I do mean live. Don't make fools out of both of us, and don't make martyrs out of the children in that school."
Dez almost told him to eat shit, but she kept her tongue. What he had just said chilled her, filling her mind with awful possibilities. "Look," she said. "Volker gave the flash drives to Billy. It's his call. I'll talk to him and get back to you."
"Very well, Officer Fox. I appreciate—"
She switched off the walkie-talkie. Moving slowly, like someone awakening after surgery, she got to her feet, closed the door, crossed to the teacher's desk, pulled out the chair, and crawled into the footwell. It was a tight, dark space that smelled of shoe polish, crayons, and old coffee. Dez pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped her arms around her shins, and laid her head down. Sobs shuddered through her whole body, and tears steamed hot and thick down her face.
"Oh, God,"
she wept.
"J.T."
The shakes began then. Dez crammed a fist into her mouth to block the scream that tried to tear its way out of her throat. Chapter 29. The Oval Office, the White House, Washington, D.C. The president returned to his office and there received an endless flow of advisors, including generals of different wattage, planners from FEMA, senators from Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, and Ohio, scientific advisors, the senior members of his staff, and Scott Blair. Over and over again, Scott Blair. His desk began piling up with reports on everything from estimated casualties, the current guess was more than 9,000, to letters from heads of state expressing sympathy and offering assistance. The offers were rote lip service that carried as little actual weight as people at a funeral suggesting the bereaved call on them if there's anything they can do. Most people wouldn't want to take that call,
and that was doubly so in global politics. Besides, the quickest way for his administration to look even weaker than it was would be to ask for help from another country. However, that was secondary. When he was alone for a few minutes, the document that caught and held the president's attention was the estimated loss of life. He read the numbers, then closed his eyes and winced as if each digit gouged a fishing hook under his skin. 9,000 people. 3 times as many people than died in the fall of the Twin Towers. Nearly twice as many as died during the Iraq War. More than twice the number of Americans killed in Afghanistan. 9,000. All in one day, on American soil, on his watch. During 9/11, he'd been a junior senator from a Midwestern state, and he'd been at home when the tragedy happened. He met with dozens of groups of citizens, from a few dozen at a Rotary Club to tens of thousands at a memorial service in a baseball stadium. He saw something in each one of them, something that connected them, one to another, while also binding them to that moment in time. It was a pervasive, shared wound that would never really heal. The scar itself would hurt, and it would continue to hurt for years, possibly for the lifetime of each person who had lived through that terrible day. Even now, so many years later, if you mentioned the towers or 9/11, there was a flicker behind the eyes. Not exactly pain, but a memory of pain, an awareness of that scar gouged into the national soul. Now this. 9,000 people dead. Not from a foreign enemy or fanatics prosecuting a radical ideology, but from within the U.S. government. Illegal bioweapons research, military action against civilians. It wouldn't matter that the research was initiated before his presidency and conducted without his knowledge. He would still be blamed. It didn't matter that Colonel Dietrich's attack on Stebbins and the school were desperate measures to prevent the pathogen from spreading and killing millions. If your dog gets out of the yard and bites people, you get no sympathy. You're still to blame. Which meant that in the eyes of the public, he was the villain of this piece. It would destroy him, his career, his credibility, and his legacy. The only chance he had, the only way he could imagine to save some shred of his presidency, would be to prove that Volker acted alone and without sanction, that the man was mentally unstable, and that all actions taken were the only ones left. All of which was true, but none of which could be proved without the flash drives. As the night wore on, he began to regret Blair's suggestion that they label Billy Trout as an anarchist hacker and cyber-terrorist. That was useful in the heart of the crisis, but if this thing was truly over, then the truth about Trout would come out, and he'd become the hero opposing the big, bad villain in the White House. Shit, he muttered. He decided that it was Scott Blair's problem to fix. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. President, the Secretary of State is here." The president rubbed his eyes and sighed. "Okay, send him in." He listened to that aide and others and still others, hearing what they said, interacting, pretending to give his full attention, while all the time waiting for General Zetter's call, waiting to be told that the drives had been obtained. Waiting for a lifeline. Then he got a call from Scott Blair. "Mr. President," said Blair, "the FBI have located Dr. Volker." Chapter 30. Good Night's Motor Court, Fayette County, Pennsylvania. The 2 FBI agents who parked in front of the motel were named Smith and Jones. Actual names, and the pairing was done by random chance rather than due to some supervisory sense of humor. Adam Smith and Miriam Jones were both of average height, average build, early 30s, with good hair and off-the-rack suits. They carried the same model handgun,
wore identical wires behind their ears, and worked out at the same gym. And they liked each other. Smith privately thought that Jones was a closet liberal who was probably using the job as a way to leverage herself into the much higher-paying world of corporate security. Jones thought that Smith was a semi-literate, mouth-breathing hawk who yearned for the chance to shoot someone. They were both entirely correct about the other. Neither ever expressed their opinions to anyone, and certainly not to their partners. On the job, they were clinically precise, appropriately efficient, and entirely humorless. Smith nodded to one of the units, whose door opened to the parking lot. A Toyota RAV4 was parked outside. "Credit card tray says Volker booked that room," he said. Jones consulted her iPhone. "Tags match." As one, they looked from Volker's car to the one parked next to it, a Crown Victoria, nearly identical to theirs. There were no other cars in that part of the lot. Sodium vapor lamps painted the falling downpour a chemical orange. Winds blew the rain across the lot in serpentine waves. They got out of their car, and Jones placed a hand on the hood of Volker's Toyota. "Cold," she said. Neither of them wore hats or used umbrellas, and they were immediately soaked. Neither of them cared. Smith felt the hood of the Crown Vic. "Warm." "Federal tags," said Jones. Smith cocked an eyebrow. "CIA?" "They weren't scheduled for this pickup," said Jones, frowning her disapproval. "Not that I heard." The agents unbuttoned their jackets to facilitate reaching their guns, crossed to the motel unit's door, and knocked. It was opened almost at once by a man dressed in a business suit very much like the one Smith wore. He had an ID wallet open to show them his credentials. "Saunders," he said. "What are you doing here?" demanded Jones. "Volker's one of ours." "We know that," said Smith, "but we were assigned to pick him up. The agency doesn't have jurisdiction here." Saunders was a tired-looking man in his 50s, probably a former field agent relegated to scut work on the downslope of his career track. "Moot now," he said, and he stepped back to open the door. Smith and Jones gave him hard looks as they entered the motel room of the man who had created Lucifer 113. They stopped just inside the door. There were two other men in the room. One was Saunders' partner, a gap-toothed and freckle-faced young man who looked like Alfred E. Newman, except he wasn't wearing a goofy smile. Instead, he was staring up at the second man. Dr. Volker's shoes swung slowly back and forth 10 inches above the carpeted floor. His arms and legs were slack, head tilted to one side, eyes wide, and tongue bulging from between his parted lips. A length of heavy-duty orange extension cord was affixed to the neck of the ceiling fan and cinched tight around Volker's throat. A handwritten note was affixed to his chest with a safety pin. "I gave my research notes to the reporter, Mr. Trout. This is all my fault. I hope there is a hell so that I may burn in it for all eternity." "Ah, shit," said Smith. "Fuck," said Jones. "Yeah," said Saunders. Chapter 31. What the Fink Thinks. WTLK Live Talk Radio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Gavin Fink's producer and engineer were screening a huge number of calls and putting them in queue. "Okay," said Gavin. "We have Ron from Fayette County. Thanks for calling." "Hey, Gavin, big fan of the show. Been listening for years." "Thanks, my man. So tell me, what do you think is happening in Stebbins?" "It's all a big government cover-up," said Ron. "I heard they were testing some kind of bioweapon on the people in Stebbins County, and it got out of control." "Whoa, that's quite a claim, Ron. What makes you think that?" "It was on the internet." "And if it's on the net, it has to be real?" "Well, no. But I saw a video by a reporter from Stebbins, Billy Trout. You know the guy who does that Fishing for News with Billy Trout thing? Did all those stories about Homer Gibbon all the way up to the execution and all. He's a real reporter.
Not sure there are any real reporters anymore, Ron, but sure, Billy Trout's a friend of the show. We had him on with a Yardley Yeti story.
I heard that show. I think that was a chupacabra.
Keeping on point here, why do you think Billy has his fingers on the pulse of a government conspiracy?
Well, come on, man. Why else would they have tried to kill him?
Chapter 32. Checkpoint number 43. Stebbins County Line. The young sergeant stepped into the muddy road and made that air-slapping gesture that meant to slow down and stop. Without turning to the captain, the driver said,
"We good here, boss?"
"I got this," said Amora. "Put on your poker faces and don't say shit." The 4 members of his team, 3 men and a woman, said nothing, but they each removed credentials from their pockets and held them on their laps. The sergeant was a thin Latino with a precisely trimmed mustache and absolutely no air of authority. New to his stripes, thought Amora.
"Identification, please,"
said the sergeant. He wore a white combat hazmat suit over which were gun and equipment belts. His protective hood was pulled off, though, and hung behind ears that stood out at right angles to his head. The sergeant looked cold, wet, far too young, and completely terrified. The rain had slowed to a steady, depressing drizzle, and the 2 small all-weather camp lanterns set on either side of the road did little to push back the darkness. Lightning flashed behind the trees, but the thunder was miles off. Another storm was coming, though. The National Weather Service was calling for nearly 5 inches of rain over the next 16 hours. The levees were going to fail, no doubt about it. And that would be proof that God or the devil was using Stebbins as a urinal, just like Scott thought. The sergeant studied the ID, then handed it back and went through the process with everyone in the car. The credentials said that Sam Imura was a captain, which was true, but it identified the others as lieutenants, which they were not. All 4 of Imura's group had once been sergeants of significant rank, from the former master sergeant at the wheel to the gunnery sergeant seated directly behind Imura. Sergeant was the most common rank among shooters in U.S. Special Forces. Each of them was certainly sharper, more knowledgeable, and more competent than most officers of any rank, and Sam Imura knew that was no exaggeration. But staying as an enlisted man kept them out of military politics. A nice, safe, sane place to be. None of them, however, currently held rank in the United States military, nor did Captain Imura. They were all officially retired, though because they were private contractors working for the government, their ranks clung to them like comfortable clothes. The sergeant glanced at the other man working the roadblock. He was an even less authoritative slice of local white bread, stood on the far side of a sawhorse barrier that would provide no real defense against a determined intrusion. He held an M16 at port arms and tried to look like G.I. Joe because there was a Humvee filled with officers. Imura accepted his ID case back. "How are you doing out here, Sergeant?"
"All quiet and secure, sir."
An answer that meant nothing. The young man gave the officers a crisp salute, which was returned in the casual manner used by career officers. Nice theater. Imura said, "There should be a 4-man post, Sergeant. Where are your other men?" The young sergeant took a moment on that.
"Sir, we're pretty thin on the ground. As far as I know, there are 2 men on every road."
He paused, as if uncertain he should have said that.
"They have 4-man teams on some of the bigger roads."
That last part sounded like a lie to Imura. He figured there were only 2 men on every road, maybe fewer on some. Between main road, side roads, farm roads, fire access roads, and walking paths, there were 97 ways to leave the town of Stebbins by wheeled vehicle. That was a minimum of 194 men per shift. Figure 12-hour shifts, and that's roughly 400 men just working roadblocks. That didn't cover supervisory personnel, reconnaissance, the men needed for reinforcing the levees, the men guarding the survivors at the little school, and patrols hunting down stray infected. It also didn't really address all of the ways out of Stebbins on foot. And the infected don't drive, he thought.
There was no point in discussing this further with someone at the sergeant's pay grade.
"Stay sharp, Sergeant," he said. "It's going to be a long night."
The white boy picked up the sawhorse and walked it to the side of the road. The Humvee began rolling through the mud into the town of Stebbins. Imura caught the driver looking in the rearview mirror.
"What?" he asked.
When alone, there was always a speak up and speak plain policy with Imura's team. The driver, whose name was Alex Foster but who was known on the job as Boxer, said,
"You realize that if anything really comes out of the woods, those two kids are a late-night snack."
It wasn't a question.
"Can't all be that bad,"
said Rachel Bloom, combat call sign Gypsy. She was second in command of the Boy Scouts, a tough woman with 5 full tours under her belt, running special operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and many more since signing with Sam. The man seated behind Boxer, Danil Shupman, known as Shortstop, said what they were all thinking. He was a pragmatic man who preferred maintaining a big-picture view of everything.
"It only takes one hole."
"Well, these infected sons of bitches aren't armed,"
said Bud Hollister, moonshiner, the rowdy former biker-turned-soldier.
"You see the footage from the school? They walked right into the bullets and didn't give much of a wet shit."
"Headshots put 'em down,"
observed Shortstop.
"Yeah?"
Moonshiner snorted.
"And how many soldiers do you know who can reliably get a headshot in a combat situation? In the dark, in the rain, in a running firefight? Please."
No one answered. Everyone cursed silently. Gypsy and Shortstop turned to look back at the small glow of lantern light that was quickly being consumed by darkness and distance. Chapter 33. Office of the National Security Advisor, the White House, Washington, D.C. Scott Blair put down the phone and sat there, staring at it, wanting to smash it, wanting to burn his office down just so the damn thing wouldn't ring again. Dr. Herman Volker was dead. God Almighty. Chapter 34. Bordentown Starbucks on Route 653, Bordentown, Pennsylvania. A bloody hand shot out and clamped around the throat of the zombie a split second before those teeth could snap shut on Goat's flesh.
"Hold on a minute, Slick,"
said Homer Gibbon. He was smiling, and there was a crooked playfulness in his voice.
"I'm trying to have a conversation here."
The zombie tried to pull free. It clawed at Homer with its fingernails and squirmed around, attempting to bite the wrist of the hand that held it. Goat shrank back from it, and then he saw the look in Homer's face. There was no trace of fear. Nothing. The man squatted there, his face and body covered with fresh blood, maggots wriggling in open wounds in his skin, and yet his mouth wore a smile of curious wonder, like that of a child watching a butterfly. Homer's eyes were filled with dark lights.
"I know you,"
he said softly, directing his words to the struggling zombie.
"I see you with a black eye. Yes, I do. I see all the way into your soul. Do you believe me?"
The creature writhed and snapped, but he was helpless in Homer's powerful grip.
"The red mouth has whispered to you, hasn't it? You understand its secrets now, don't you, boy?" "Yes, I can see that you do. And that red mouth is screaming so loud inside your head that you have to do something. You have to let it speak through you. You have to feed it because it's so goddamn hungry. Tell me if I'm lying."
The zombie did not respond, though Goat turned to look at it, to seek for something in its eyes. Was there something there? Was there a flicker of something deep in those dark wells?
They say that the eyes are the windows of the soul. Goat had heard that 1,000,000 times. If so, then these windows looked into a landscape that had suddenly become blighted, like the floodplains of Mississippi and Louisiana after the levees failed. Like Japan after the tsunami, there was wreckage that proved that life had once existed there, but the life itself was gone. Or was it? Yes, you've heard the red mouth speak and you've listened, haven't you, boy? You listened real good and you took it all to heart. Oh, that's nice. That's real nice. For the briefest of moments, as Homer spoke to the infected in his slow, rhythmic backwoods voice, Goat thought he saw a shadow move behind the zombie's eyes. Was it the mind of the dead leaving a deserted house? Or was it something else? A lingering trace of the man Homer had killed, a ghost haunting the body it once owned. Whatever was happening, it was horrible from every angle. A life destroyed, a monster created, and a soul... what? Lost? Trapped? Goat's mind rebelled at placing too precise a label on it. The zombie pounded at Homer's hand with soft, clumsy fists. Without turning to Goat, Homer spoke to him. "I done this, you know." "What?" "I done this. This plague thing. It ain't no bioweapon like they're saying on the radio. It was me that done this. The black eye opened in my mind, and now I speak with the voice of the red mouth. Used to be I was a slave of the red mouth, or at least I thought I was. But after I died and woke up in that body bag, well, hell, I knew. I realized that all this time the black eye was my own mind's eye, and the red mouth is my mouth. You understand what I mean by that, son?" Goat didn't know how to answer that question. It seemed like there was a thin tightrope between possible answers, and that rope was covered in slippery grease. He clamped his mouth shut and shook his head. "Go on, son," said Homer, clearly understanding Goat's reluctance. "Don't be shy. I won't bite." There was a beat after that last phrase came out, and then Homer realized what he had said and what it meant, and he burst out laughing. The zombie pounded on his arm, tore at the flesh of the hand holding him. Black saliva dribbled from the corners of his mouth. Suddenly Homer got to his feet and dragged the zombie upright. It was a display of enormous strength, because the struggling infected had to weigh at least 200 pounds. Homer let go of the creature's throat, grabbed both shoulders, spun him around, and shoved him toward the door. The zombie staggered and tripped over the twitching legs of a barista who was just now returning from some dark place to a world that was darker still. Homer looked down at her and at the man he had just shoved. "This is about to get twitchy," he said, though Goat didn't know if he was speaking to himself or not. Then a slow smile began to form on the killer's pale lips, and he turned fully toward Goat. That smile was perhaps the most frightening thing Goat had ever seen. Homer once more stabbed a finger at Goat. "You tell stories, right? I mean, that's what reporters do, right?" Goat nodded. A tiny, frightened nod. But there didn't seem to be any traps built into so simple a question. The zombie Homer had shoved spun back around, and he lunged forward, not at Homer, but to try and barrel past him to get to the only person in the whole place who wasn't dying or dead. Goat. Without a blink, without a fragment of hesitation, Homer drove an elbow into the zombie's face with such sudden, shocking force that the infected's whole upper torso froze in place while his legs ran up into the air. Then the creature's body canted backward, and he fell bonelessly to the floor.
The back of his head struck the marble floor and exploded, spraying red and black outward in a starburst pattern. His legs and arms instantly stopped moving, and he lay dead. Truly dead.
"Impolite motherfucker,"
muttered Homer. Then he smiled once more at Goat.
"Where was I? Oh, yeah, telling stories and shit. During my trial and when they killed me, you were one of those asshole reporters who was there nearly every day telling the court's version of my story. Only the thing is, it isn't really my story. It isn't the story of the black eye and the red mouth. No, sir, it is not. It isn't the full story, and it sure as shit ain't the right story. And let's face it, son, I got a story worth telling. Look at me. I mean, seriously, look at fucking me."
Goat couldn't take his eyes off of Homer Gibbon. The man was huge, powerful, covered in blood, and he was a monster. An actual monster. Something the world had never seen before. Dead and yet not dead. Infected with the Lucifer 113 plague and yet still capable of thought, though whether that was rational thought was up for debate in Goat's mind. A man who had been the nation's most notorious serial killer, up there with legendary murderers like Ed Gein, Albert Fish, St. John, and Ted Bundy, and who had been tried, convicted, and executed. And who was now what, exactly? Was he a victim of Dr. Volker's insane desire to punish criminals of this kind? Yes. Was he the brutal and sadistic maniac who slaughtered people and deserved the punishment given him? Absolutely. Was he patient zero of a new plague, something that, should it be allowed to spread, could become an unstoppable pandemic? Yes. God Almighty, thought Goat. He felt like fireworks were exploding inside his head. Everything was too bright, too loud, too massively wrong, and all of these thoughts tumbled through his brain in a burning moment. Homer was still speaking, but his smile had dimmed.
"Are you listening to me, boy? You'd better be, 'cause it looks like you're ankle-deep in shit right about now. Tell me I'm wrong. No? Nothing? But I got your attention, right? Give me a nod or something, boy."
Goat nodded.
"Good boy,"
said Homer, his grin returning. A few of the other dead were starting to rise.
"We ain't got no time at all, so how about we cut the shit and get to it?"
Goat found himself nodding again, though he had no idea what the "it" was Homer wanted to get to. The twitching woman rolled over onto hands and knees and began to rise. Homer took 2 short steps closer and snapped his foot out in a powerful kick that sent her sprawling into the path of 2 other dead who had managed to get to their feet. The 3 of them collapsed into a hissing tangle of arms and legs. Homer snorted, amused by it, but at the same time he seemed momentarily uncertain as he watched his clumsy victims.
"Shit,"
he breathed, drawing it out. Then he blinked and turned back to Goat.
"Okay, boy, here's the deal. I'm gonna get my ass out of here before this becomes a buffet. I don't think these fuckers will hurt me, not with the black eye open inside my mind, but they'll definitely go ass wild on you. You're a bag of bones, but I'll bet there's some tasty meat on you. Yes, sir."
Goat felt blood drain from his face.
"But I think I'd rather let you keep sucking air. For a while, anyway. You game with that?"
The sound that escaped Goat's throat might have been a yes, but it sounded like a mouse's squeak. Homer took it as assent, though, and he nodded.
"So here's the deal. You come with me. You do what reporters do. Interview me, whatever. You do that for me, You tell my story, my side of it. You let the red mouth speak through me, and you write down every word and then pretty it up some for the newspapers. What do they call it? Edit it? Rewrite it? Whatever. You do that, and you play fair with me while you're doing it. You make sure to tell the whole truth, and you might just walk away from this. How's that sound?
The dead were getting up now. The 3 who had fallen and others. Goat didn't know how many people had been in the Starbucks when Homer came in. 14, give or take. Some of them were hurt, but not dead, victims of Homer's rage. Shattered bodies, torn limbs, bitten flesh. No one was whole. No one was uninfected. Except him. The moans of the newly resurrected dead filled the store.
Think quick, son,
said Homer.
Big old fucking clock ticking right here.
Goat tried to answer, squeaked again, coughed his throat clear, and forced out a reply. You promise you won't hurt me? He hated how weak and small and terrified his voice sounded. And he hated it much more when he saw how his words and his tone changed the grin on Homer's face. The killer licked the blood from his teeth and lips.
I just said I wouldn't hurt you, boy.
No, insisted Goat, grabbing whatever thread of a lifeline he could. Listen, you want your story told? I mean, really told? Told so that it reaches everyone and everyone knows who you really are? That's what you want? Then I can give it to you. I'm the one who broke this story. Me and my friend Billy Trout. I got the story out that no one else could. I know how to make sure it gets out. Homer narrowed his eyes. There were sudden screams behind Goat, and he turned to see the newly risen dead falling on the dying victims of Homer Gibbon. The infected snarled and growled as they tore into living flesh. Blood sprayed the walls, and the screams were high and piercing and entirely without hope.
You broke that story,
said Homer slowly. Yes, Billy and I.
I heard that Trout fellow on the news.
He's still inside the town. In Stebbins. He's at the school. The screams rose and rose. Goat cringed away from it, edging toward Homer only because he was closer to the door. If he could get Homer to take him outside, then maybe Goat could make a break for it. The highway was right there. He'd take his chances with high-speed traffic in the rain. Homer was still studying him with narrowed, suspicious eyes. Then his eyes flicked to what was going on behind Goat.
Shit,
he grumbled.
Those are some persistent fuckers.
There was no need for Goat to look. The slap of slow feet on the wet floor told the story. Please, begged Goat. Homer snaked out a hand, caught Goat by the front of his shirt, and jerked him forward just as something brushed the nape of Goat's neck. As he stumbled forward, the cameraman craned his head around to see long red fingers clutching at the air where his head had been a moment ago. I need my laptop, Goat said, and my camera bag. Homer shrugged. He picked up the MacBook and tossed it to Goat, then snatched the handle of the canvas camera bag out from under a murder victim who was twitching his way back from death. Homer slung the heavy bag on his brawny shoulder and began backing toward the door as the zombies shuffled forward.
Get your ass in gear,
warned Homer as he grabbed Goat again and hauled him away. Goat staggered toward the door and then thrust through it into the rain. He wanted to slam it in Homer's face, but the hydraulic door closer was too strong. Homer came outside and he tried to slam it too. When it resisted him, he leaned his full weight against it. The dead hit the door with enough slack weight to push it several inches outward again.
Shit,
said Homer, though he did not seem particularly concerned. He still held Goat with one hand and had the other pressed against the glass. He cut a sharp look at Goat.
Listen to me, boy. We gotta make a run for the car or they'll eat your dick sure as God made little green apples. And I want you to listen real hard to what I have to say now. If I let you go and you try to run, then you better pray that I can't run faster than you. 'Cause if I catch you, then I'm gonna bite your dick off and make you eat it. You believe me when I tell you that?"
Goat did, and he said so. Homer pushed back against the door.
"Then let's go. Car's unlocked. Go!"
He shoved Goat toward the passenger side and held the door long enough for the cameraman to take a few stumbling steps, correct himself, and begin backing toward the car. Goat clutched the laptop to his chest as if it was a shield. 40 feet away, the highway was bright with headlights and fast metal. Could he make it? Then he caught Homer watching him. The killer turned to follow Goat's line of sight, then turned back and smiled.
"Call the play, son."
Goat's heart hammered like desperate fists. Tears fell down his hot cheeks. His legs and muscles trembled with adrenaline and terror.
"Go,"
he told himself.
"Go, go, go!"
A sob broke from his chest as he spun around and reached for the door handle of the metallic green Nissan Cube. Chapter 35. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Billy Trout left the basement gymnasium after the bodies had been taken care of. Because they were forbidden to open the exterior doors to the school, the 2 corpses in their makeshift body bags were placed in one of the shower stalls. After the others left, Billy lingered and stared down at the silent forms. He wanted to say something. A prayer or something of importance. But even though he kept calling on God since this whole thing started, his actual faith was as dead as the town. This sort of thing did little to rekindle what had always been a weak flame in him. Even so, he mumbled something, a fragment of the Lord's Prayer, getting some of the words wrong, but getting the gist of it out there. For the dead, in case they believed. And in case he was wrong about there being no God. Trout was open to taking any help they could get. He'd have prayed to the flying spaghetti monster if he thought it would earn the people in this school even a small measure of grace. Then, heavy-hearted, he turned away and climbed the stairs to the first floor. He tried again to call Goat, but he still had no signal. Frowning, he went to the second floor and found a room with big windows, so there was no chance of interference. Nothing. The little meter on the satellite phone said that he still had half a charge. Power, but no signal. No contact with Goat or with anyone. The explanation for it was obvious to the realist in him, but Trout resisted it nonetheless. He didn't want it to be the case.
"Uh-oh,"
he murmured. Depressed and frightened, he went downstairs and looked once more into the big classroom. 2 of the teachers were handing out little plastic containers of fruit cocktail. Trout thought it was such a bizarre sight. He remembered getting those little cups when he was a kid in this school. It was always a happy moment. They packed a ton of sugar into those cups, and it was nice to see halved maraschino cherries floating among the chunks of peach and pear. Now it seemed incredibly sad. The children took the cups, opened them with clumsy fingers, spooned out the fruit, chewed, swallowed, and all in a ghastly silence. Trout backed out of the room and went to find Des. At first, she seemed to be nowhere at all, and he poked his head into every room. Then he caught sight of her heading toward the fire tower at the far end of the hall. He immediately understood where she was heading. He limped down the hall as quickly as he could, hissing whenever the pain shot down the back of his leg. The heavy fire tower door creaked as he opened it, and for a moment he listened to the sounds from below. Soft footfalls fading into silence. He descended slowly and silently, and finally paused on the stone steps, and saw her there, standing with her palms on the steel door, shoulders slumped, head bowed. On the other side of that door
was what was left of the infected from the school. And JT. He was out there too. Damn, breathed Trout. His voice was soft, but in the utter stillness of the fire tower it carried, and Des suddenly stiffened. She didn't turn, though.
Billy? Yeah, babe.
There was a beat.
Don't call me that.
All right. Sorry. Now wasn't the time to test the limits of whatever new connection they had forged. He descended the last few steps and moved toward her, mindful to come into her peripheral vision, well out of strike range. Experience is a wonderful teacher. She stared at the closed door as if it were made of glass.
What do you want?
He almost said that he came looking to see how she was, but Trout preferred his balls still attached to his body. So instead he said,
They said they'd airdrop some food to us. That's fine, but nobody I talk to knows how to get up on the roof without going outside.
There's a fire access stairway.
Right. Okay, that's good, he said.
But no one else knew that. She turned to look at him, but said nothing.
Once they drop the stuff, Trout continued, it's got to be inspected, sorted, and distributed. You've seen how people are reacting. They're going to do it wrong. Some of these people are a twitch away from losing it. They might grab stuff or hoard stuff. We have to take control of things. We have to make sure we do everything right.
Her eyes searched his face, and after a long moment, she gave a single nod.
There's something else, he said. No, two things. The first is that we have to triple check everyone. I mean everyone.
We did. No one has a bite.
That's not what I'm saying. The guy the guy down in the gym, I didn't see a bite on him.
A line formed between her brows. Of course there was a bite.
No, there wasn't. I checked everywhere. I even had to cut his clothes off just to be sure.
She pushed off from the wall and turned completely to him, her eyes hostile and hot. The fuck are you trying to say, Billy?
That guy didn't die from a bite. Maybe he got infected some other way. Maybe he got some of the black blood in his mouth. When Goat and I interviewed Volker, he said something about the infected spitting, so maybe it was that.
Shit.
Or maybe it's just enough to get blood on your skin. Everybody's pretty badly dinged up. Maybe the worms in the blood can get into an open wound and...
His voice trailed off. Both of them wore clothes that were caked with dried blood. A lot of that was black blood. Des began wiping at her clothes, almost absently at first, and then she started slapping at her uniform faster and faster until her hands became a hysterical blur.
"Stop it!"
yelled Trout. He had to yell it 3 times before she froze. For a moment, Des's eyes were so wild that the whites showed all around. Crazy eyes. Trout had seen her like that before. Once, naked and wild-eyed, she had chased him with a shotgun. Not one of their better moments as a couple.
"Des, we wiped ourselves down with Purell, remember? Remember? You damn near did jello shots of the stuff."
The wild look slowly faded, and she gave him a slow nod. She was panting, though.
Right. Sorry. Jeez. I'm sorry."
Trout tried to touch her, to give her arm a reassuring squeeze or maybe coax her into a hug, but Des walked a few paces away, hands on hips, and stared at the wall as she worked on her breathing. Without turning, she asked, "Volker gave you all that research stuff on a couple of flash drives, right?"
"Sure.
Goat has them and..." She half turned. "Did you think to keep a copy of it?" Trout shook his head.
"There wasn't time for that. Things were already falling apart. I dropped him at the county line, and he walked across a field to the Starbucks in Bordentown, and I went to my office to get the satellite phone. Things just kept going wrong from then on."
"Why?" Des chewed her lip for a moment, then tapped the walkie-talkie on her hip.
"General Zetter called me on the walkie-talkie.
They want the drives."
"I bet they do."
He said that they need the science and research on them. Apparently that ass pirate Volker did something to the Lucifer disease thing. Changed it somehow. They don't understand what he did, and they can't come up with a way of stopping it without Volker's notes. Trout slumped. Oh, damn it. Zetter thinks you have them. How do they even know about them? Mused Trout. Wait, no, that's my bad. I may have mentioned something in my last broadcast. That was stupid. I was making a point about being stupid. Des, they need that stuff. Zetter didn't go so far as making a direct threat, but with all those guns out there pointed at us, he doesn't really have to. I told him that if he tried to storm the place and take the drives by force, I'd destroy them. What did you do that for? Her eyes shifted away. I didn't know what else to tell him, and you wanted him to think we had something he needed. Okay, I get it. It was... What? Stupid? Are you going to throw that back in my face? No, I'm not, he said with a smile. I was going to say that it was an understandable stalling tactic. She grunted. We need to get in touch with Goat. Maybe he can email stuff to us. There have to be flash drives here. If we can send the stuff, we could actually have something to bargain with. Trout held out the satellite phone. That was the second thing I wanted to tell you, he said. I can't get a call through to Goat. What? I know. Where'd you call from? Maybe there's no reception down in the... I've called from a dozen different places on the first and second floor, right by the windows, too. Nothing. Shit. What I don't get, said Trout, is why they're bullying us about this. All they have to do is talk to Volker. Zetter said they can't find Volker. Oh, crap. So, Des asked, what do we do now? Trout shook his head. Jeez, I really don't know. Keep trying to get in touch with Goat. Billy, said Des. We could tell them where to find Goat. And have them put a bullet in his head? Trout fired back. No thanks. Would you rather they stormed in here with all these kids? I'd rather we find a way to get in touch with Goat. They looked at each other for a few moments, and then off into separate quadrants of the middle distance. Can we use the walkie-talkie to call Goat? Asked Trout. I don't know. If so, I wouldn't know how, she admitted. Then she tilted her head to one side as if listening to a thought. Could they be blocking the sat phone somehow? I mean, could they be jamming it or something? Goat could tell you that, said Trout. He's the techno geek. But it's possible, right? They thought about the situation for a long time, but neither of them had a solution. Dez's knowledge of electronics didn't extend much beyond downloading Hank Williams Jr. ringtones and watching YouTube videos. Trout was more savvy, but nowhere close to Goat's level. I guess so, Trout said at last. It's funny. We had a story scheduled about the 21st Century Army, but I haven't started the research yet. Bad timing. Yeah. It blows that the death of our entire town got in the way of your job. Oh, bite me, Des. You know what I mean. I know. I was making a joke. Hilarious. She ignored him. So, where does that leave us other than 5 miles up Shit Creek? Not sure what we can do beyond keep trying, he said. I'll call Goat every minute if I have to. Why bother? She said. What? Des walked over to the door that separated her from whatever remained of J.T. Hammond. This is all totally fucked, she said. We're wasting our time. Zetter is going to come in here whether we help him or not. We're completely screwed. She leaned her forehead against the cold metal. Why don't you go upstairs? Why don't you? To do what? Count how many people were going to get killed? He walked over and stood a few feet away. Des, a few minutes ago you just gave a pretty good speech about searching the building and taking responsibility. That was good. It helped. You got this group of refugees in motion. They searched the building. It's clear. Mission accomplished. Now leave me alone. That's not what I mean, said Trout. I'm trying to say that